I can still remember the stifling silence of that night, the kind that settles too thickly in the air like a damp blanket. You can't shrug off the house we rented for our business trip. Loomed in the darkness, old shutters creaking in an almost rhythmic pattern. No wind touched the tall trees outside, yet somehow they seemed to sway as if caught in a silent storm. The porch light flickered, casting jittery shadows that danced across the warped wooden planks. Even before I set foot inside, something felt wrong, like the entire place was holding its breath, waiting to exhale the moment we let our guard down. I had arrived in this small town earlier that afternoon alongside my colleague who traveled with me as part of our job. We were both commercial representatives, and our work often took us to remote places where we would stay in whatever accommodation was cheap and available. This time we had booked a modest house that stood on the edge of a winding country road. It was far from the main square, which meant the streets were emptier and darker than anything I was used to. The first impression of the house was not entirely unpleasant. It was quaint in a worn-out way, with a wooden exterior that showed signs of age but still possessed a certain rustic charm. There was no immediate indication of the unsettling night to come, but I remember feeling a faint unease in my stomach when I walked in. The interior smelled faintly of stale air, as though no one had lived there for quite some time. The floors creaked with every step, and the walls seemed almost too bare, with just a few outdated pictures and a mirror in the hallway. My colleague claimed the smaller bedroom near the front window, while I took the slightly larger one in the back. We had spent a long day on the road and were looking forward to resting before meeting our client. In the morning, before turning in, we decided to make a quick run to a local grocery store a few blocks away to grab a few snacks and drinks. It was during that brief outing that something began to shift. The grocery store was nearly empty. A handful of flickering fluorescent lights illuminated the aisles, but the rest remained oddly dim, as if half the bulbs had burned out long ago. My colleague and I walked through the aisles, noting how limited the stock was. It felt almost apocalyptic. Seeing so many barren shelves still, we picked out some bags of chips, a few sodas, and some bottled water. I tried to shrug off the strange vibe I got from the store, attributing it to the late hour and my own fatigue. It never occurred to me that someone else might be watching us. When we returned to the house, we set our groceries on the kitchen table. A single overhead light cast an anemic glow barely reaching the corners of the room. The countertops were a tired shade of yellow, and the cabinets hung slightly askew, revealing chipped paint and tarnished handles. My colleague suggested we get some rest to be fresh for the next day. I nodded in agreement, feeling a sense of relief at the idea of lying down, but that relief would be short-lived. Soon after we separated into our respective rooms, I felt a subtle vibration in my pocket. Checking my phone, I saw a text message from an unknown number. The content made my heart skip a beat. It mentioned the brand of chips I had just purchased, followed by a detail about the flavor my colleague preferred. At first I thought it had to be someone from our circle of work contacts playing a prank. Maybe a coworker who had seen us on the road and wanted to mess with us, but my chest tightened because I hadn't mentioned that specific snack to anyone. My colleague and I had only been in that store for 5 minutes, speaking quietly about which chips we liked, trying to calm down. I walked to my colleague's door and tapped lightly. We spoke in hushed tones through the cracked doorway, both of us puzzled. He told me to ignore it, that it might be a random scam message. He half-jokingly said there must be coincidences sometimes, especially in small towns where local numbers got recycled. Despite his attempt to sound dismissive, I could hear the unease in his voice. We agreed to keep our phones on silent and call it a night. I went back to my room. The bed was lumpy and covered in old-fashioned sheets that gave off a faint scent of mothballs. I found myself lying awake, tension coiling in my stomach. It was impossible to shake off the feeling that someone somewhere had been watching us in that grocery store, or maybe even before that. My phone vibrated again, this time. The message described how I was pacing around my room looking nervous. My pulse hammered as I read the words. I stared at the corners of the ceiling, searching for any hidden cameras, any sign of tampering. Nothing my colleague mentioned from the other side of the wall that something felt off in his room too. Though he didn't go into detail, I paced some more. Unsure what to do next, deciding it might be best to confront the messages directly, I typed a response to the unknown number demanding to know who it was and why they were sending these invasive texts. My palms grew clammy and a chill passed through my spine when my phone buzzed again. I hesitated before looking. The new message simply read that I shouldn't worry because everything was under control and I was better off staying wide awake. At that moment, I became aware of the acute silence in the house. No sound came from the street, no hum of distant cars or passing motorcycles. Even the usual night insects seemed to have vanished. My throat felt dry and each breath took conscious effort. I wandered into the hallway thinking I might step into the kitchen for a glass of water. The corridor was darker than before, as if the single light bulb overhead had dimmed. My footsteps resonated against the wooden floor, a hollow echo that made my skin prickle. As I neared the kitchen, I noticed a faint movement from the corner of my eye. The curtains in the living room, which I had left open earlier, were fluttering softly. Although no draft came through the closed windows, they swayed in a gentle but unmistakable pattern as if guided by unseen hands. The pit in my stomach deepened. I turned on the light in the living room only to find the bulb flickered once and then died. My heart pounded so violently I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. In the dim glow from the kitchen, I saw the curtains come to a standstill, dropping limply back against the window frame. I told myself it had to be some quirk of the old house, maybe a vent or some gap in the wall. Desperate for any semblance of normality, I went into the kitchen and turned on the faucet to fill a glass. The handle felt stiff and the water took a few seconds to come out. It was lukewarm and the pipes groaned as if resenting my need for a drink. After my first sip, the lights overhead flickered in that fraction of a second between brightness and darkness. I saw something dart across the hallway, something tall and shadowy. I nearly dropped the glass. My heart racing so fast I thought I might pass out. I told myself it was just my imagination, a flicker of light playing tricks on me, but I sensed a shift in the atmosphere as if the very air had grown heavier. The phone in my pocket vibrated again. My fingers trembled as I read another message that water won't help, you'll stay awake anyway. My chest constricted and cold sweat broke out across my forehead. My colleague was probably experiencing the same horror in his own room, yet we had agreed not to panic each other against my better judgment. I crept back to my bedroom, shutting the door behind me and turning the lock with shaky hands. Time crawled at an agonizing pace. Every creak of the floorboard seemed amplified. Every shift of wind outside sounded like footsteps. And then there was the bathroom sink. At first, just a faint dripping, then a heavier flow as though someone had turned the faucet on full blast. My mind raced. Had my colleague gotten up? Was the faucet broken? Yet I couldn't muster the courage to step out into that hallway again. At least, not immediately. I stood against the bedroom door, pressing my ear to the wood. The rush of water continued, then it stopped abruptly. I felt a compulsion to check, if only to confirm that I wasn't losing my grip on reality. Forcing myself to turn the knob, I ventured into the corridor once more. My legs felt weak. I approached the bathroom doorway and found the light already on. The sink was still dripping droplets plinking against the porcelain. Though the faucet had been closed, water continued to ooze out. Forming a small puddle around the drain, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the mirror above the sink. My face was pale sweat beading on my temples, eyes wide with confusion and fear. Then my phone buzzed again, making my heart jerk. Another text checked the mirror more closely. Nausea swelled within me. I glanced up at my reflection, once again noticing how warped it looked. My features seemed subtly distorted, as though the mirror's surface was not quite flat. I stepped closer and saw the overhead light flicker, bending my reflection in ways that defied normal physics. It could have been an optical illusion, a trick of old glass and failing electricity. But at that moment it felt like the mirror was alive, or at least possessed by something that thrived on my terror. A sudden rustling sound made me spin around. The hallway behind me was empty, but I felt certain something had been there just seconds before my legs shook and my breathing turned shallow. I retreated to my room, locking the door again and pressing my back against it. The messages kept coming, though I tried to ignore them. They described my every action, how I was standing, how my breath was ragged, even the way my hands kept shaking. Whoever was sending these texts had eyes on me, or worse, they were inside my head. I couldn't decide which possibility scared me more. Around this time, my colleague tapped lightly on my door, asking if I could hear the strange noises too. I responded that I could, my voice barely rising above a whisper. He then mentioned he was receiving odd messages, ones that described his every move and told him not to sleep. It felt surreal, hearing confirmation that I wasn't alone in this. Neither of us dared raise our voices or go searching for help. The very walls seemed to be listening, waiting for us to reveal our fear so it could amplify it. Hours passed in a torment of creeping dread. The house became a canvas for every nightmare scenario running through my head. I heard faint knocks behind the walls, the floorboards squeaking outside my door, the faint rustle of curtains. Even though no wind blew, sometimes I thought I heard whispering in the hall, though I could never distinguish words, just a low, unintelligible murmur that made my skin crawl. My body shook with each wave of adrenaline. Sweat soaked the back of my shirt, yet I felt cold, as if an icy current licked at my skin. Somewhere close to dawn, the messages stopped. I hadn't realized how quiet my phone had become until I checked it and saw the last text had arrived nearly an hour earlier. It simply said, "Don't think you're safe." By then, the sky was lightening to a dull gray, and a weak glow filtered through the thin curtains. Exhaustion weighed down my eyelids, but I was too terrified to succumb to sleep. My colleague's door creaked, and I heard him step into the hallway. He said he wanted to get out of the house as soon as possible to pack up and leave. I agreed. Silently, words caught in my throat, we gathered our belongings in tense silence, each movement feeling magnified in the still morning. The air was less oppressive now, but the memory of that suffocating tension remained. Neither of us dared to check every room thoroughly. Instead, we made sure we had our phones, laptops, and any essential items. The rest could be replaced if needed. Our only objective was to leave the house and never look back. As I closed the front door behind us, I couldn't resist a final glance at the windows for just a second. I imagined I saw a flicker of movement behind the curtains. My pulse quickened, but I said nothing. We drove away from that small town, our tires kicking up gravel and dust. The early sunlight casting long shadows across the road. My colleague and I tried to discuss the events in a logical way. Maybe we had fallen victim to some elaborate prank or local superstition. Maybe the house was rigged with hidden cameras, yet neither explanation fully accounted for the unsettling text that matched our actions in real time, nor did it explain the cold presence that made every hair on my body stand on end. We reached the highway and breathed a collective sigh of relief, but deep down I knew the experience would never truly leave me. Weeks later, I still find myself waking in the middle of the night, gasping for air, convinced that my phone is buzzing with more messages. My heart thunders against my ribcage until I check the screen and see no new notifications. Even so, I can't shake the feeling that whoever or whatever was behind those messages might still be out there watching from some dark corner, just waiting for the perfect moment to remind me that I'm not safe. Sometimes I replay the events of that night in my mind, searching for clues or rational explanations, but the more I reflect, the stronger my suspicion grows that we encountered something beyond mere surveillance or pranks to this day. I don't know if it was a person with twisted motives or if something else had latched onto our presence in 2000, that lonely house. All I know is that every instinct in my body screamed that we were being toyed with by a force that fed on our fear. I still see flashes of that warped reflection in the bathroom mirror when I close my eyes too long. I still feel a phantom chill wash over me when I stand alone in a dark room, and on the rare occasions I find myself in another quiet, desolate place for work, I catch myself glancing at my phone, half dreading, half expecting another text from that unknown number. The worst part is the lingering uncertainty. Whoever sent those messages never demanded money or made overt threats. Instead, they seemed fixated on the notion of keeping us awake, heightening our paranoia, pushing us to the edge. The horror of it wasn't in any explicit violence, but rather in the way it invaded our minds, sowing seeds of distrust in our own perceptions, even though we left that house intact. A piece of me feels as though I never truly escaped every bump in the night, every flicker of the lights, every unexplained rustle of fabric in a still room now carries echoes of that oppressive darkness. It's a reminder that sometimes terror doesn't need to manifest in physical harm. Sometimes it's enough that it watches you, learns your fears, and makes you doubt your own senses. I've tried to move on, pouring myself into work, convincing my colleague that it must have been a fluke yet. No matter how busy we stay, the memory of that night lingers, casting a shadow over every mundane action. We've stayed in countless rentals since then, and none have shown the same signs of malevolence. But whenever I encounter a flickering light or a slowly dripping faucet, my stomach tightens with dread. I recall the way the curtains moved on their own, how the house's silence turned suffocating, how the techs knew precisely what we were doing in real time. Even now, I keep my phone locked away when I'm alone at night. The idea of another unknown number lighting up the screen is enough to make my hands shake, despite all logic telling me it couldn't possibly be the same presence. My instincts remain on high alert, and in those solitary moments, just before I drift off to sleep, I sometimes sense a faint prickling at the back of my neck, as if unseen eyes are studying me from a corner. I refuse to acknowledge deep inside. I realize the fear may never fully subside. It's a burden I carry with me, a reminder that there are places and forces in this world that exist just beyond our comfortable understanding at the end of it all. I'm left with an unsettling truth. There are horrors we can't explain, terrors that don't rely on bloodshed or open violence. Sometimes the simplest act of observation of someone or something observing us can prove more harrowing than any physical threat. Because in that silent gaze and those messages that know our every move lies the ultimate assault on our minds. We become our own worst enemy, questioning each sound, each shadow, each flicker of light until reality itself feels like it's unraveling. And in my case, I'm still not certain it is finished unraveling. There is no tidy conclusion, no definitive answer. All I have is that gnawing doubt, the knowledge that some things linger in the darkness long after sunrise. So I continue my travels, meeting new clients in new towns, always a bit more guarded, always glancing over my shoulder. The memory of that old house in the small town stays with me, a permanent scar etched into my thoughts, a constant whisper that warns, remain vigilant, because sometimes in the hush of the night, the phone still vibrates without reason. And for a heartbeat, I convince myself it's them again, whoever or whatever they were waiting to remind me they never truly left. I don't know if that moment will ever come, but the anticipation alone is enough to keep me awake, staring into the darkness, listening for sounds that may or may not be there, and that in its own twisted way is a horror I can't escape. I still remember how the stale air of that old office seemed to cling to my skin the moment I stepped inside. The corridor walls were painted in a dull shade of gray that felt more like a warning than a choice of decor. My pulse quickened, and I couldn't explain why something about that place felt wrong from the start, as if it were quietly protesting my presence. I told myself it was just the pressure of starting a new assignment. After all, I was only supposed to spend a few nights here cleaning and organizing outdated hardware. It was a straightforward IT gig, one that in theory shouldn't have been terrifying at all. My name is Eric, and I usually work as a freelance IT analyst. I go from company to company, troubleshooting servers, decommissioning old hardware, and taking care of tasks that require some technical know-how and a willingness to do the dirty work. Most of the time, I don't mind the quiet, solitary nature of the job, but there was nothing normal about this building. It had once housed a major corporation's administrative offices. They had downsized years ago, leaving behind a dusty labyrinth of empty cubicles and abandoned conference rooms. When I took this assignment, no one told me about the rumors on my first day while hauling old monitors to a storage closet. A couple of the building staff members mentioned something about the top floor, the one with the decommissioned meeting rooms. They told me that people sometimes heard heavy footsteps at night and doors banging for no reason. Some referred to it as the presence upstairs, giving me grim looks when they talked about it. Others simply joked that I should never wander there alone at night, although they didn't look like they were kidding. I tried to laugh it off after all. I was a rational man who dealt in cables, hard drives, and system code. Not in ghost stories that changed on the second night I worked there. I needed to reboot one of the older servers that was still active, so I stayed past midnight. The entire building seemed to exhale emptiness. Every corridor a tunnel of darkness lit only by a few flickering fluorescent lights. My shoes echoed with each step, and I couldn't help but notice a faint odor in the air, a mix of old carpet mildew and something accurate I couldn't identify as I walked to the server room, which was inconveniently located near the stairwell leading to the top floor. I heard a distinct thud from above. It sounded like someone dropping a heavy box. My chest tightened. The thud repeated more rhythmically this time, like footsteps pacing back and forth. I told myself it was just the creaking of old architecture or perhaps the building's ventilation system. Yet my heart pounded so hard that I had to stop and catch my breath. Once the server reboot was complete, I decided to finish up quickly. I was almost out the door when I heard a door upstairs slam. It was abrupt and violent, echoing down the stairwell. I felt my stomach twist, my body tensed, sweat forming at my temples. My instinct was to run, but I forced myself to remain calm rationally. The place should be empty. No one was scheduled to be on that floor, and security would have locked up hours ago. But I couldn't ignore the fact that something or someone had just slammed a door. I tried to reassure myself that perhaps a window was left open up there, causing a draft, but the closed windows along the corridor suggested otherwise. Without wanting to investigate, I hurried to turn off the lights in the server room and head downstairs. On my way, I felt a sudden jolt of panic. The overhead lights flickered just once, but enough to make me gasp in that brief moment of flicker. I had the unsettling impression that a tall figure stood at the far end of the corridor. I couldn't see any details, just the outline of something impossibly tall and still. My heart hammered so hard I could barely breathe, but when the light stabilized, there was nothing there. I left the building in a state of near panic. Refusing to look back that night, I barely slept. My mind racing through possibilities. Maybe the figure was a trick of the mind caused by exhaustion. I told myself I needed to get more rest to stop letting old ghost stories invade my thoughts. But the next day, when I confided in a coworker what I thought I had seen, she recounted rumors of a tall, shadowy presence that several employees had glimpsed. She described it as an elongated silhouette lurking near the corners of corridors, always watching, never approaching. I felt a twinge of nausea as she spoke. It seemed too specific to dismiss as an optical illusion. Over the following week, each time I needed to work late, I found myself dreading that building. My palms would sweat the moment I entered the lobby. The quiet hum of the fluorescent lights made me feel on edge, yet my tasks forced me to stay because certain server checks had to be done after hours to avoid disrupting daytime operations. Unfortunately, the older hardware was stored on the very floor everyone avoided. I would stare at the elevator doors for a long moment, then choose the stairs. Instead, something about stepping into an enclosed metal box made me feel even more vulnerable. Most nights I heard small noises that could be dismissed as the building settling, a faint crack here, a groan of metal there. But there were times I clearly heard footsteps above me, heavy, deliberate steps that seemed to circle the perimeter of the top floor. Whenever that happened, my chest tightened and I'd break into a cold sweat. My mouth would go dry and I'd wait, half holding my breath, hoping the sounds would stop. Often they did, but the silence that followed was sometimes worse. It felt like waiting for the next heartbeat of something enormous and hidden. One night I tried to bring a coworker upstairs with me just for company. She insisted she was too busy with her own tasks. I nearly begged her, but ultimately I went alone. I recall gripping the rail of the staircase so tightly my knuckles went white. The corridor lights flickered more than usual. My ears seemed hyper-aware of every little sound, the faint buzz of electricity, my own shoes scraping the floor, and the blood pounding in my ears. When I opened the door to the main corridor of the top floor, I felt an immediate urge to flee. The atmosphere was thick, as if the air itself carried a menacing weight. I could smell that acrid scent again, some cross between burnt plastic and decaying drywall. My stomach churned and I swallowed hard, determined to get my job done fast as I moved to collect some old routers from a dusty room. I caught something in the reflection of the glass wall that separated this room from the next. It was that same towering figure standing at the other end of the corridor, motionless. Staring at me, I froze and the reflex made my whole body go rigid, my breath catching in my throat for what felt like ages. I couldn't tear my gaze away. Then, without warning, the figure took a step back and the reflection vanished. I turned around, but there was nothing there. Just an empty corridor with outdated furniture stacked haphazardly. By this point, my nerves were frayed. I felt an uneasy mix of terror and curiosity, but I mostly just wanted to get out. My mind raced. Could it be a trick of the overhead lighting? Was I having a stress-induced hallucination, the sense that something was watching me, that it could appear anywhere, anytime, gnawed at me constantly? My coworkers seemed unconcerned, content to believe it was all part of the building's ghost story, but I knew what I had seen. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was no mere shadow. In the following days, I found myself avoiding eye contact with the stairwell to the upper floor each time I passed it. I'd get that tight feeling in my chest, that sense of being observed at night if I was forced to be there. Every echo, every creak seemed to magnify a hundredfold. There were also times I heard a faint whisper, though I couldn't make out words, only the soft, persistent murmur of something not quite human. My body would respond with a surge of adrenaline, heart slamming against my ribcage. Limbs going clammy, my supervisors began asking if I was feeling all right. I tried to explain in vague terms that the place was getting to me, that the environment felt oppressive. They offered to let me adjust my hours, perhaps coming in earlier in the evening so I could leave before midnight. But a few tasks still needed to be done in the early morning hours, and inevitably I found myself alone in that place. One particularly unsettling night, I was in the second-floor server room running firmware updates around 2 a.m. I heard a door upstairs slam 3 times in quick succession. It was so loud that I felt it in my chest. My throat constricted and I nearly dropped my flashlight. The temptation to flee was overwhelming, but I remembered that the servers would be in the middle of a critical update for another half hour if I left. Then it could corrupt the entire system, so I stayed, each minute stretched into an eternity. The next few minutes passed in eerie silence, and I almost convinced myself that maybe the wind had blown through an open window. Then directly above my head, I heard what sounded like rapid footsteps running across the floor. They paused near the edge of the corridor right above me before dashing back in the opposite direction. My breathing was shallow, my heart slamming like a drum. I couldn't understand how any living person could move that fast, that frantically in an otherwise empty floor. When the firmware update finally completed, I grabbed my things and headed downstairs toward the exit. The hallway lights flickered again. My entire body quaked with dread. I heard a faint scraping sound like nails dragging across metal echoing from the upper floor. I had to fight the primal urge to run in that moment. It felt as though the building itself was alive, demanding my fear as payment for trespassing. My pulse pounded in my ears and my vision tunneled. By the time I made it to the front door, my hands were shaking so hard that I struggled with the key card. Finally, the lock clicked and I stumbled out, gulping fresh air like a drowning man. After that episode, I seriously considered quitting. I told the temp agency the project was beyond my scope, but they insisted the client was pleased with my work and offered me a raise. If I stayed on just a bit longer, they needed the final inventory and hardware disposal plan against my better judgment. I agreed, but I resolved to never venture upstairs alone at night again. A few evenings later, circumstances forced me to break that promise. A series of system errors required manual restarts, and these errors always came at the worst possible times at around 11:45 p.m. I found myself standing in front of that damn staircase again, telling myself I could do this quickly and get out. My mind was in a battle with my adrenaline. Every sense was heightened and the building felt unnaturally still. Climbing the stairs, I kept seeing movements in my peripheral vision, shadows flickering just beyond my line of sight. My skin prickled with goosebumps and my heart hammered in my chest. The corridor on the top floor was darker than usual, a few lights completely out, leaving long stretches of darkness. I used my flashlight, but it seemed to illuminate only a narrow path, leaving the rest of the corridor in suffocating gloom. As I approached the final conference room, the door creaked open on its own. My breath caught in my throat. The darkness beyond that door felt alive, a tangible force pressing against my senses. Then I heard something, a guttural rasp, as though someone or something was struggling to breathe. My legs nearly gave out beneath me, but I forced myself forward, pushing the door fully open with a trembling hand. Inside, the air was colder than the rest of the floor, and an unrelenting sense of being observed weighed heavily on me. I shone my flashlight around, and that's when I noticed the reflection in the large glass panel at the back of the room. The tall figure stood there again, looming impossibly high. My chest constricted as I watched it raise what looked like an arm far too long to be human. My entire body seized in panic. I wanted to scream, but my voice seemed locked inside my throat. I stumbled backward, tripping over a pile of cables. Flashlight clattering on the floor in the frantic moment that followed. I scrambled to pick it up, flicking the beam wildly around the room. The figure was gone. I wasn't sure whether that was more comforting or more terrifying. Something inside me broke at that moment, and fear gave way to a jolt of desperate determination. I ran out of the room, slamming the door behind me, and sprinted down the corridor. My lungs burned and my vision blurred with tears of pure terror. It felt as though the building itself pulsed with malevolence, each step echoing a fraction of a second too late, as if something followed in perfect mimicry. By the time I reached the stairs, my knees wobbled and I nearly collapsed. I forced myself down step by agonizing step, feeling as if I was descending into some other realm rather than escaping it. When I finally burst into the ground floor lobby, I was shaking so violently that I could hardly function. My mind raced with questions. Was that entity real, or had I gone mad from stress and lack of sleep? Why did it watch me, and why did it lurk in reflections? The uneasy possibility that it was feeding off my fear. Noted at me, I left that night and never returned alone. I negotiated daytime-only shifts, strictly refusing any nighttime assignments. My supervisors weren't thrilled, but they allowed it. Possibly seeing the terror etched on my face whenever they asked about the presence upstairs, I'd only say I wanted no part of it. Even recalling the memories makes my heart pound. Eventually, the job ended. I completed my tasks, signed off the inventory, and moved on to my next contract. But the echoes of that building have never left me to this day. I'll catch myself glancing at reflective surfaces in unfamiliar corridors, half expecting to see that impossibly tall shape standing there. Watching sometimes at night, I'll hear noises in my own home that remind me of those footsteps pounding overhead. I'll bolt upright in bed, breath ragged, heart hammering until I remind myself where I am. Yet a nagging doubt remains. Did I escape that presence, or did it follow me? I can't say for certain. All I know is that whenever I recall the stale air, the flickering lights, and that looming silhouette, a chill crawls down my spine that no amount of reassurance can erase. I survived that place physically unscathed, but a lingering unease haunts me. A piece of that old office is lodged somewhere deep in my mind. Sometimes I wonder if the darkness I encountered was simply a reflection of my own stress and anxieties, or if in fact that building concealed something far more malevolent than a haunted legend. Either way, I haven't found a definitive explanation, just a lasting dread. And whenever I hear a door slam or see a flicker of movement in a corridor, I can't help but remember that place and its silent watcher waiting in the shadows. I used to believe that the quietest hours before dawn held a sort of solemn beauty. I was convinced there was something almost spiritual about existing in a space that was usually crowded and chaotic, only to find it deserted and silent. That changed the night I heard a whisper echoing from the men's locker room when there was no one else around. Ever since then, the silence in that 24-hour gym has taken on a menacing edge, and I can't walk through those heavy glass doors without feeling my heartbeat rattle my entire chest. I had signed up for the gym membership during a promotional event lured by the promise of modern equipment and the convenience of being able to go whenever I liked. At first, I was thrilled by the idea of midnight or early morning workouts because my schedule was unpredictable. Sometimes I'd be free at midday, other times at midnight, so the flexibility was a gift. I felt like I had the place to myself. When I trained at 2 or 3 in the morning, there were no queues for machines, no loud grunts from the weightlifters, no strangers hogging the squat rack for a few weeks. This arrangement seemed ideal until the strangeness began with subtle, almost dismissible signs. I remember the first time I noticed something was off. It was an ordinary night, or so it seemed. I had arrived around 1 a.m., the automated doors giving their usual mechanical hiss as I stepped into the artificially lit reception area. The overhead lights were a sickly yellow, and despite the immaculately cleaned floors, I detected the faint smell of disinfectant that always hung around the front desk. Usually I'd see maybe 1 or 2 other people on the treadmills or elliptical trainers, but that evening the place appeared deserted. I had my earphones in, hoping to keep myself motivated through a long cardio session as I climbed onto a treadmill. I felt a slight chill. At first I blamed the air conditioning, which was always set far too low during the night. My arms prickled with goosebumps and I shrugged it off as a trivial reaction to the cold. But there was something more. I sensed an undercurrent in the air, a subtle tension I couldn't quite name. It was like the entire gym was holding its breath within 15 minutes. I found myself restless. Instead of the usual steady rhythm of running, I kept glancing over my shoulders, certain I was about to spot someone lurking behind me. Of course, every time I looked, there was no one. Only the dim reflection of my own figure in the floor-to-ceiling mirrors and the uniform rows of equipment. The overhead lights flickered once or twice, but I told myself that was just faulty wiring. By the time I finished my run, I was drenched in sweat and more fatigued by nervous tension than by actual exertion. The next odd occurrence happened a few days later. I was wrapping up a shoulder workout around 2:30 a.m., moving from the free weights to the stretching area. The silence was all-encompassing, the only consistent sound being the dull hum of the vents pushing out that icy air as I lowered myself onto the mat to stretch. I heard an odd patter. It was like the shuffle of feet on the rubber flooring. I paused, heart-thudding, and scanned my surroundings empty again. Still the sound continued for a second or two, then stopped abruptly when I got up to investigate. Walking around the rows of machines, not a single person was in sight. Part of me reasoned I might have heard my own footsteps echoing, or maybe an old ventilation pipe was responsible, so I forced myself to move on. Attributing it to my imagination, it was a couple of weeks later that I encountered the voice. That night I was more tired than usual, having worked a late shift. Still, I felt compelled to fit in at least a short workout. I arrived just after 3 a.m. The overhead lights were half-dimmed, casting long, unsettling shadows across the weight machines. There was a different smell lingering in the air. It reminded me of damp towels that had been left too long in a corner. Musky, faintly sour, and not at all comforting. I started my routine with some light cardio, then proceeded to do a few sets of bench presses. Midway through my last set, I realized I was unbelievably thirsty. My throat felt dry and sandpaper rough, so I decided to take a short break and head to the water fountain near the men's locker room. The corridor leading there was bathed in flickering fluorescent light, the harsh glow seeming to strobe against the pale tiles. My footsteps echoed oddly, as if the hallway was stretching longer with each step. Just as I bent down to fill my bottle, I heard a faint whisper in Portuguese. It was distinctly clear, but drained of volume as if carried by a dying breath. The words were "ponte," and the invitation or command, whatever it was, stopped me cold. Initially, I assumed it was another gym-goer calling out from inside the locker room, maybe beckoning a friend. Yet the voice felt off, like someone speaking from a distance that was both too close and too far. At the same time, heart-pounding, I stood upright and scanned the corridor. The door to the men's locker room was slightly ajar, and no light seemed to be on inside, just a dim glow from a single overhead bulb. I told myself it had to be a staff member or some other restless soul. So, taking a tentative step forward, I called out a soft greeting. No response came, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. I could almost feel eyes peering at me from the dark recesses. Stepping inside, I was met with an unearthly stillness. The row of lockers stretched out in front of me, and the room smelled of antiseptic mixed with stale sweat. My skin crawled as I walked past bench after bench, each unoccupied, each silent. I reached the showers and found the stalls empty. The entire space was deserted, yet I couldn't shake the certainty that someone had spoken to me only moments before I stood there, water bottle in hand, ears straining for any rustle or breath. When nothing followed, I quickly turned and left, feeling more unsettled than I could ever recall being in a public space over the next few nights. I couldn't shake the memory of that whisper. It replayed in my mind incessantly. Sometimes I would be in the middle of a set of squats and the phrase would ring in my ears again as if someone had just spoken behind me. My workout suffered because I started rushing through exercises, eager to finish and leave, but every time I tried to push the incident to the back of my mind, a new layer of dread draped itself over me. Another disturbing incident hit like a thunderclap. About a week later, I'd convinced myself to face my unease head-on by returning at my usual late hour. The place was emptier than ever, with no sign of the night staff. Though the front desk light was on, the entire building felt hollow. I did my best to ignore the gloom and focus on the rhythmic clang of weights. Halfway through my routine, the faint overhead music cut off abruptly, plunging the gym into silence. Except for my own breathing, then a distortion of static crackled through the speakers like a whisper full of watery hisses. No words were distinct, but the noise had an undeniably human quality to it, as if layered with quiet. Moans the sound stretched on for what felt like minutes before snapping back into silence. By that point, my hands were shaking. I dropped the dumbbells, feeling my palms slick with cold sweat, and I could taste fear like copper on my tongue, shaken but determined not to be controlled by my own paranoia. I reasoned I would just do a couple more sets and leave the sense of a presence. Lurking was back stronger than before. Every time I turned, I thought I saw a shape moving around the corners of the mirrored walls. My reflection seemed elongated, twisted as though the mirror itself was warping. The overhead lights flickered relentlessly, creating brief intervals of darkness that felt like an entirely different realm in those split-second blackouts. I swore I saw outlines of something not human. Shapes flickering at the edge of my vision by the time I finished and walked toward the locker room to grab my bag. Every nerve in my body was on fire. The corridor leading there was colder than before, making me shiver. Despite my sweaty workout clothes, I pressed my ear close to the locker room door, unsure why I was even doing it, and I heard faint breathing. It was soft, deliberate, and it made my stomach knot. My mind screamed at me to turn and leave, but some grim curiosity pulled me forward. The instant I crossed the threshold, the lights above me went out in pitch blackness. I felt claustrophobic, my breath catching in my throat, reaching into my pocket. I hurriedly fished out my phone to use its flashlight. The weak beam illuminated only a small patch of the floor in front of me. With each step, the fluorescent fixtures overhead buzzed like insects trapped in a jar, occasionally sputtering with a sickly light that revealed lockers and benches and fragmented glimpses. Then I saw it, a figure or a shadow. It was impossible to say which. Looming at the far end, the shape seemed to hover without the normal posture of a person standing on two legs. I tried to call out, but my voice failed. Nothing came out but a ragged gasp. The shadow flickered or shifted, and in one fleeting second of faint light, it appeared to vanish. I stood there, paralyzed, heart pounding so hard that each beat echoed in my ears. Suddenly, the overhead fixtures blinked back on, revealing the space in full clarity. Once again, the corridor of lockers was bare. It was an empty, ordinary locker room, as if nothing had ever been there at that moment. I felt an intense wave of dizziness, and it took a concerted effort to remain upright. My pulse wouldn't slow. My breathing was ragged, and a cold sweat coated every inch of my skin. I must have staggered out of the locker room and hurried to collect my belongings from the bench near the entrance. My hands trembled so badly that I nearly dropped my phone twice while stuffing it back into my pocket. My only coherent thought was to get out of that building, out into the safety of the night air. The automated doors slid open excruciatingly slowly. When I finally stepped outside, I realized I was panting as though I had run a marathon. The freedom of the open air felt fleeting, though I kept looking over my shoulder all the way to my car, convinced that something or someone was watching me from behind the tinted windows. In the following days, I tried to rationalize. I told myself it was stress or that my imagination had run amok in the echoing emptiness of the gym. Maybe I was overtired, or maybe the new supplements I'd been taking had triggered jitters or hallucinations. But late at night, as I lay in bed, images of that shadow and the echo of that disembodied potentate consumed my thoughts. I felt trapped in a spiral of dread, and I couldn't dislodge the fear that there was something malevolent in that place, something that thrived in the silent hours. Eventually, I confided in a friend who also happened to be a personal trainer. I avoided direct quotes as much as possible, telling him indirectly that I had experienced some deeply unsettling encounters and that I was questioning my own sanity. He offered the typical logical explanations about faulty electrical systems, echoic chambers, and the impressionable nature of the mind. In a polite but concerned way, he suggested, maybe I should work out during the day at least until I felt more comfortable. Part of me felt relieved to hear him say these things. It validated that the rational side of me could still attempt to find normal explanations. A few weeks passed, and I mostly avoided the gym at night, opting for afternoon or early evening sessions. The facility was busier than filled with everyday noise and the mundane hustle of people rushing to complete their routines. I started to feel safer. However, my schedule eventually forced me into another late-night session, and the moment I stepped through those doors, the memory of that suffocating tension washed over me. I stayed hyper-aware of my surroundings, listening for any odd sounds or whispers. The place was quiet in all the wrong ways. I tried to keep my workout short. My intention was to do only a couple of exercises and leave. After finishing the last set of bicep curls, I inched toward the corridor where the water fountain was located. Although I felt reluctant, my thirst was overpowering. The fountain's trickle sounded unnaturally loud, a soft metallic gurgle that echoed down the hallway as I took a sip. That same Portuguese phrase reverberated in my mind. My heart thumped so hard I felt a tremor in my ribs. The men's locker room door was open, just a crack, but the darkness beyond felt like a living, breathing thing. I experienced a strange magnetism pulling me there, but I resisted. I turned away, refusing to let my curiosity lure me inside. The entire time I had the uncanny feeling that someone or something was behind that door, quietly urging me to come in. A wave of revulsion passed over me, and I left without even returning my towel to the rack. My only intention was escape, no matter how cowardly I felt now whenever I passed by the gym. Late at night, I can't bring myself to go in. Even seeing those lights glowing in the glass front triggers a tightness in my chest. I keep remembering the subtle shift in the air, the scratching static in the speakers, and that formless shadow I nearly walked into. Worst of all, I recall the voice that sounded both near and distant. Haunt on the memory is enough to send chills drilling into my spine, and I have no rational explanation that can soothe the dread it planted in my mind. Sometimes I ask myself if I was singled out or if others have heard it too. Since it all happened, I haven't spoken about it much, and the gym staff never bring up anything unusual. It's almost like there's a silent agreement to ignore the eerie atmosphere that descends at night, or maybe no one else has experienced the same level of horror. I still find myself wondering if there really was an entity there, feeding on fear, or if my mind twisted normal occurrences into something horrifying. Even now, I question my own sanity at times, but the fact remains, I heard that whisper, I saw that shape. I felt an oppressive presence in the darkness of that locker room, a sensation so vivid it's impossible to dismiss as a mere trick of light. My body's reactions racing, heart hair standing on end, clammy palms were real and undeniable. That night changed me, and it left an imprint on my psyche that refuses to fade. I've never gone back during those haunted hours, never walked down that flickering corridor alone again. And though I continue my daytime workouts, the fear still lingers in the back of my mind, as if waiting to pounce the slightest malfunction of a light bulb, or the faintest echo in an empty gym can make my stomach seize with panic. I'm always on guard, half expecting to hear that disembodied voice calling out from the locker room once more, coaxing me into a darkness from which I might not return. The worst part is, it leaves me with the uneasy possibility that sometimes the darkness beyond our own reflections is not empty. Something could be there waiting in the silent hush of early morning, inviting us further into shadowed corridors and quiet rooms. And when I remember that creeping dread and that single chilling phrase, I know one thing: I would rather stay outside in the safety of the night air than ever cross the threshold into that echoing void. Again, the air clung to us like a thick invisible film the moment we stepped into that abandoned industrial zone. Something about the place felt inherently wrong, as though it was trying to repel us. Even before we crossed the threshold, the jagged outlines of rusted metal beams against a darkening sky seemed to stand in silent warning. Yet my friends and I couldn't resist the pull of our own curiosity. We believed naively that we would explore, get a little thrill, and then leave no harm done. None of us realized how deeply the heavy atmosphere and sour stench would burrow into our minds. I remember the road leading to the industrial park was cracked and pitted, flanked by fields of tall, dry grass that rattled in the breeze. An old chain-link fence with more holes than intact mesh was the only barrier between civilization and that decaying wasteland. We'd heard rumors that chemicals had once been processed there, but nobody bothered to confirm. We just wanted an adventure, so we found a gap in the fence, slipped through, and navigated the deserted lot until we arrived at a massive corrugated metal building looming in the gloom. From the outside, the warehouse was colossal, its roof sagging in places and large doors left hanging crooked on rusted hinges when we pushed one of those doors open. It scraped along the concrete floor in a slow, tortured groan. The noise made my spine tingle. I recall stepping inside, first shining my small flashlight across the interior. The beam illuminated dust motes swirling in the stale air. The place smelled foul, stale, sour, almost like old milk that had turned, but also chemical in a way that made my eyes water. My throat felt scratchy. I wanted to cough, but somehow I held it in. I tried to brush off the creeping dread as I waited for the others to follow. Dan, who usually cracked a joke to lighten the mood, seemed uncharacteristically quiet. I heard him mumble something about how this might not be as fun as we thought. He wanted to keep going, though. So we continued. The inside of the warehouse was lined with defunct conveyor belts, metal tables, and enormous vats that once must have held industrial fluids overhead. Fluorescent lights dangled from bent fixtures. They no longer worked, of course, but I kept glancing up, half expecting them to flicker to life. Instead, we had only our flashlights and the occasional faint glow from the holes in the roof. I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows under the machinery were deeper than they should be. It was as though they were absorbing the light instead of reflecting it. Each time my flashlight beam passed over a dark corner, I felt a gentle tug of apprehension. My heart thudded in my chest and my palms grew damp around the handle of the flashlight. Every small sound metal creaking, a single droplet of water hitting the floor, echoed painfully in my ears. My breathing sped up and I tried to keep it quiet so I could listen for anything else that might lurk in the darkness. We fanned out, each of us drawn to different areas. At one point, I ran my hand along a section of rusted piping. The metal flaked away at my touch, leaving orange-brown residue on my fingers. I wiped it off on my jeans, but I couldn't get rid of the gritty sensation, as if the rust clung to my skin. The sour smell intensified as I moved closer to the center of the warehouse, where a massive machine stood silent and forbidding. It was covered in cracked paint with what looked like tangled hoses. Sprouting from its sides, the floor around it was stained with something dark and oily in my mind. I told myself it was just old chemicals, but my stomach churned with a nameless dread. I felt a presence then, as if someone was standing just behind me. My neck hair bristled, my heart hammered, and a bead of cold sweat trickled down my temple. I spun around, shining my flashlight in a wide arc. Nobody was there, only a cluster of upright tanks and conveyor belts that stretched off into the gloom. I let out a shaky breath, telling myself I was being foolish, but that feeling lingered, as though I had intruded on something's territory, and it watched me from just beyond the edge of my vision. A few yards away, one of my friends was fiddling with some levers on a broken control panel. He mentioned in a low mutter that these must have operated the conveyor belts. The rest of us gathered around the machine. We exchanged looks that said we should probably move on. Some unspoken tension passed among us. I wondered if they felt that same pressure in the air, that quiet insistence that we didn't belong. We headed deeper into the building, stepping over piles of debris, broken crates, fragments of scrap metal, and torn industrial tarps. The further we went, the heavier the atmosphere became. It felt harder to breathe, as though my lungs were straining against a weight pressing on my chest. My flashlight flickered once, twice, and then steadied. It was enough to send a jolt of panic through me. The last thing I wanted was for the light to fail in that suffocating darkness. As we approached the back of the warehouse, we found a row of offices sealed behind glass windows. The windows were so grimy that it was impossible to see inside without wiping the sludge away. I hesitated, but eventually used my sleeve to create a streaky portal into the gloom. The beam of my flashlight revealed a cramped room filled with file cabinets and a few desks. All in disarray, chairs were knocked over, drawers yanked open, documents scattered across the floor. The sour smell grew even more potent near this office section. My eyes watered and my stomach twisted. It was as if something had leaked out of the walls and infected the air. I noticed a movement from the corner of my eye, a quick flicker of shadow across the other side of the glass. My breath caught in my throat. My pulse slammed in my ears. I jerked my flashlight toward the spot, but there was nothing, just the ghostly reflection of our group in the grimy glass. Looking far more nervous than we had upon arrival, I tried to tell myself it was just a trick of the light, yet I couldn't shake the crawling feeling on the back of my neck. We left the offices behind, deciding it was time to circle around and head for the exit. We hadn't been inside for more than 30 minutes, but it felt like hours. My mouth was so dry I had to swallow repeatedly to keep from gagging. Another friend mentioned in a tense whisper that the smell was getting worse instead of dissipating. He wondered if there might be chemical spills deeper in the building. Someone else suggested we leave right then, but curiosity still battled with our unease. We pressed on, hoping that taking a complete loop around would feel less like we'd run away in fear. With every step, the sense of being watched multiplied. The enormous machines, silent and immovable, seemed to loom larger, as if alive in their own menacing way. The shadows, thick and almost tangible, seemed to pulse with an unseen energy. My breathing grew ragged and every muscle in my body felt tense. Each breath carried that acrid tang, burning my nostrils and coating the back of my throat. The corridor we entered next was lined on both sides by tall racks that once held equipment or spare parts. Now most of them lay toppled, their shelves empty or strewn with debris. My flashlight revealed twisted shapes that looked like they had melted, congealed into lumps that defied easy explanation. A sense of dread settled in my stomach. Cold and relentless. Was this the result of some chemical reaction or something else entirely? As we neared the exit, one of us suggested we regroup and calmly walk the rest of the way without splitting up. We formed a tight cluster, flashlights overlapping to create a larger circle of illumination. The beams of light jittered along the walls and ceiling, revealing streaks of rust and filth that almost looked like spreading veins each time we passed another piece of decrepit machinery. I strained my hearing for any sign of movement behind us. The silence became loud, pressing against my eardrums until I wished for even the smallest, most innocuous noise to break the tension, but the only sound I could detect was my own panicked breathing. Then for a brief moment, the sour smell subsided, replaced by a cool draft wafting in from a large set of double doors. Relief surged through my body. I could see the outline of the exit in the weak exterior light. My heart pounded, urging me forward. The feeling of oppression that plagued me was starting to loosen its grip just a bit. But as we drew closer, the entire building seemed to exhale some foul breath of its own. The sour stench hit like a physical blow, worse than anything I had experienced so far. My knees wobbled and I struggled not to retch. I heard my friends letting out muffled curses covering their mouths and noses. It was as if the place refused to let us leave without one final assault on our senses. A wave of nausea hit me so hard I had to lean against a rusted support beam. My flashlight dropped, clattering to the ground and rolling a few feet away. The flashlight's beam landed on one of the broken machines, illuminating the space beneath it. In an odd angle, for a second I thought I saw something move there, some shape that was not part of the machinery. My vision blurred and I blinked furiously. The shape looked almost gelatinous. Quivering in the half-light, it seemed to vanish. The instant I tried to focus on it, I forced myself upright. Ignoring the shakiness in my limbs, I retrieved my flashlight and rejoined the group. No one spoke directly, but I caught the stark fear in their eyes. We knew without words that we had to get out. We made a final push toward the exit, refusing to let ourselves be defeated by panic. Yet my heart hammered in my chest and my breath came in ragged gulps. I could feel sweat trickling down my back, chilling my skin in the damp air. The closer we got to those double doors, the more the atmosphere seemed to swirl around us in a suffocating dance. Shadows elongated and warped, distorting the shapes of the machinery into monstrous silhouettes. My flashlight flickered again and I nearly lost my nerve. I told myself to keep it together outside. I could see a sliver of the dark sky, a faint promise of escape from this suffocating darkness. When we finally reached the threshold, I could barely breathe. My lungs felt seared by the chemical stench. My nerves frayed by the constant sense of pursuit from those silent shadows. Stepping over the doorway felt like crossing from one reality into another. The night air was cold, but it was a blessing compared to what we had just endured inside. I tasted freedom in that first gulp of cleaner air, even though the sour odor clung to my clothes and hair. Yet even outside, I felt no true relief. The warehouse loomed behind us, its jagged outline framed by the moonlight. My heart was still pounding and a cold sweat covered my forehead. I found myself turning around, shining my flashlight back at the open door. For a moment, I thought I saw a faint movement within, as though something receded deeper into the darkness. It left me with a spine-tingling certainty that the place housed a presence far beyond our comprehension. One of my friends remarked that it was time to head home. Another added, we should never return. There was an undercurrent of mutual agreement in the group. We began to walk away, our flashlights bobbing in the night. But the sense of being followed lingered, as if the dense air from the warehouse had latched onto us. I kept glancing over my shoulder, heart racing. Each time I imagined a flicker of motion in my periphery. Once we reached the gap in the fence, the night breeze gained some freshness. My eyes stung from the strain of tension and my hands trembled. I was sweating. Despite the cool air, we slipped back onto the deserted street. Each step feeling both urgent and numb. I realized my entire body was covered in goosebumps, and my nerves felt raw in that quiet. I replayed every unsettling moment in my head, asking myself if I had truly seen those shifting shadows, or if my mind had conjured them in the throes of fear. We parted ways without ceremony, each of us carrying that intangible weight back to our homes. Once I stepped inside my room, I dropped onto my bedclothes, still damp with sweat and reeking of that sour stench. My mind wouldn't shut off the images of the dark warehouse corners. The ghostly flicker of movement and the oppressive silence haunted my thoughts. Each time I closed my eyes, I felt that presence near me, lurking in the recesses of my imagination, or perhaps somewhere else. My skin prickled with unease. Sleep eventually overtook me, but it was restless. I dreamed of endless corridors stretching from that warehouse, each one leading deeper into gloom. And every time I turned a corner, I sensed a form slithering just out of sight. In the dream, my footsteps echoed off distant walls as I ran in slow motion, my heart pounding so violently I thought it would burst. When I jerked awake, my body was slick with sweat, my breath coming in gasps. The darkness in my bedroom seemed thick, but at least I knew I was far from that cursed place. I tried to discuss the experience a few days later with Dan in an effort to make sense of it. He brushed it off lightly at first, then admitted he had been feeling an odd paranoia since the night we explored. He didn't go into detail, just a vague mention of being unable to sleep well and seeing things in the corners of his eyes. I confided I was experiencing the same anxieties. We agreed without hesitation never to return. Neither of us wanted to find out if the intangible presence could manifest itself more concretely. Even now, I can't fully explain what we encountered in that abandoned industrial zone. Perhaps the chemicals left behind played tricks on our senses, warping our perception and conjuring hallucinations. Or maybe there was something else, some force that had claimed the warehouse as its domain, feeding on the fear and curiosity of unwary visitors. I can't decide which explanation scares me more. The days and weeks that followed were marked by sporadic waves of claustrophobia and an abiding sense that I was being observed. My imagination or whatever had latched onto me refused to grant me peace at night. When the wind howls outside, I sometimes catch a whiff of that sour odor and my heart kicks into overdrive. My palms get slick and a chill spider walks up my spine. It's enough to send me reeling back into the memory of that dismal, reeking corridor. Yet the strangest part is that none of us ever reported any physical ailments beyond the lingering psychological horror. No mysterious illnesses, no rotting shoes from chemical spills, no tangible proof that the place had harmed us physically. The only residue was mental, a wedge of dread lodged deep in our minds. Sometimes late at night, I wonder if that intangible presence found a way to follow us home silent and invisible, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. I've kept quiet about the incident for the most part, only discussing it with those who were there. We have a mutual unspoken pact that we will not entertain the idea of exploring abandoned sites anymore. Not because we fear broken floors or tetanus-laden nails, but because there are places in the world where the veil is thin, where something beyond reason or science might lurk. I'm not the same person I was before that night. My nerves are more afraid, my sense of security always under question. I don't look at shadows in the same way. Even the simplest shapes cast on walls can set my pulse racing if I'm not careful. And whenever I catch that sour tang in the air, even if it's just a passing whiff from some distant chemical, I find my thoughts dragged back to the towering rusted machines and those unseen eyes in the darkness. The memory sends shivers through my body, reminding me how utterly powerless I felt in the end. I suppose I'm grateful we managed to leave that warehouse physically unscathed, but the mental scars remain etched into the corners of my subconscious. Sometimes in the late hours of the night, I question whether the worst terror is the one that never fully reveals itself, that stays hidden, just out of sight, drifting on stale air and waiting. The unknown can make any shadow ominous, any unexplained noise a threat, and any foul stench a silent promise of something far more disturbing lying in wait. I've kept this story to myself long enough that it feels like a permanent secret whispering incessantly in my ear whenever I let my guard down, and though I try to rationalize it, chemicals, old machinery, and overactive imagination, there's a piece of me that knows the truth lies beyond those surface explanations. Something was there, something hungry or angry or simply alien. It reached into my mind that night, left a fingerprint of dread, and ensured I would never forget the way my heart thundered in my chest when it felt like we were trespassing on forbidden ground. We never did return, and I have no intention of ever stepping foot in that forsaken building again. Even the memory of the air thick with that nauseating stench is enough to make my mouth go dry and my pulse accelerate sometimes. In my quieter moments, I wonder if that presence still waits among the rusted machines shifting in the darkness, listening for the sound of intruders. And if it does, maybe we're the lucky ones. Maybe it was never meant to be seen or understood, but the knowledge that it exists or might exist is enough to keep me on edge whenever I pass by an old decrepit structure. Because once you feel that oppressive air and sense that living darkness pressing against your mind, there's no return to blissful ignorance. You carry the fear with you, tucked away like a foul secret, haunting you with every breath. I first sensed something was wrong on the day I walked into that narrow, dimly lit hallway. The stale air clung to my skin and an inexplicable chill ran down my spine. The moment I turned the key in the apartment door, something about the building's silence felt unnatural, more like a hush forced upon it than a peaceful quiet. Even before I noticed the flickering lights or heard the echo of mysterious footsteps, I felt as though I was trespassing in a place that resisted my presence. It was an old construction in the heart of the city. with high ceilings and long corridors that played tricks on the eyes. At night, the shadows cast by the single overhead light seemed to stretch unnaturally against the walls as though they had a life of their own. I had moved there for convenience. The centralized location was perfect for my work routine, and the rent surprisingly affordable. On my first walk through, the place looked normal enough. Sure, the paint was peeling in a few spots. The wooden floors creaked and there was a musty smell that lingered, but I chalked it up to the building's age. I remember feeling oddly defensive about my choice, telling friends. Whenever they asked that, I found the apartment charming and full of character. Looking back, I wonder if I was in denial or just under the apartment's spell. When I started noticing the hallway lights flickering, I assumed it was a simple electrical issue. The quarter light would blink erratically, a frantic strobe that made the walls appear to ripple. I replaced the bulbs with brand new ones, certain that would solve the problem. It didn't even. The new bulbs would flicker, then sometimes go out entirely. At first, I convinced myself it was a matter of faulty wiring. After all, the apartment was old, probably never fully renovated, but then the overhead light in the living room began doing the same thing. I'd be sitting on the couch after a long day at work reading a book or scrolling through my phone, and it would blink once, twice, then extinguish just when I stood up to check. It would flare back to life again. My heart rate would spike each time this happened. A subtle panic would tighten my chest and I'd find myself breathing faster. I tried to be rational. Maybe the wiring was loose or the circuit was overloaded by the outdated fixtures. Yet a part of me felt something else was behind it. Something that teased me with tiny unsettling hints that I couldn't ignore. A few weeks passed and I began hearing sounds at night. They were faint at first, like a floorboard squeaking in another room or a door hinge shuddering in a far corner. I'd jerk awake to a subtle creaking noise, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. Often I'd lie in bed forcing myself to remain still, listening intently. My apartment was on the 3rd floor, so it wasn't likely to be a stray cat on the balcony or street noises drifting through the windows. Sometimes it sounded like footsteps, as if someone was pacing in the living room. The measured, deliberate rhythm of those steps sent ice into my veins. On more than one occasion, I mustered the courage to get out of bed to check the living room. My legs trembled so much it felt like I was wading through water. My palms turned clammy and my breath grew ragged. Each step I took seemed to reverberate inside my skull when I finally flicked on the hallway light switch and prayed it would actually stay on. There was never anyone there, but something else caught my attention. The corridor light, the same one that had refused to stay lit before, would be on already. It made no sense. I was certain I always switched it off before bed. But there it was, shining in that eerie, flickering way, convinced I was losing my mind. I brought in an electrician. He walked around the apartment, performed the usual checks, and assured me there was nothing wrong with the wiring. I remember him shrugging with a baffled expression as he said something about everything being up to code. His confusion did nothing to alleviate my own. After he left, the flickering continued and the footsteps grew louder. Some nights I'd swear I felt the floor vibrate slightly, like heavy boots pressing down just outside my bedroom door. Sleep became almost impossible. I would lie awake, every muscle in my body so tense that my neck would ache for hours. My heartbeat throbbed in my ears too fast, like a drumbeat signaling that something terrible hovered in the darkness. My mind would play tricks on me. Was the door handle turning on its own? Did I just hear a whisper, or was that the wind outside? The tension built until my hands began to shake. Whenever the lights blinked one night, I thought I caught a glimpse of a shape, just a fleeting shadow darting across the end of the hallway. My chest tightened with such force that I could barely draw breath. I wasn't sure if it was real or my imagination. All I knew was that every hair on my body stood on end and cold sweat ran down my back. Desperation led me to try sleeping with all the lights on. I thought that a fully lit apartment might banish the darkness, and with it, whatever presence lurked there. The result was far from comforting. The perpetual glow cast harsh shadows on the walls, and I found myself startled by every flicker, every reflection in the mirrors or windows. My nerves were constantly on edge, like a wound-up spring. The faint hum of the light fixtures filled the silence, and my exhaustion deepened. It wasn't restful at all. I felt like a prisoner in my own space, eyes open wide, scanning the corners and ceilings for any sign of movement. I started dreading coming home the moment I stepped into the building's lobby. That heavy, suffocating feeling would return. I'd feel it in my chest. Like my lungs couldn't expand all the way. My pace would quicken as I marched up the winding staircase, each step echoing against the chipped walls. The corridor that led to my apartment seemed longer at night, its shadows and flickering lights creating a distorted tunnel effect. Sometimes I sensed the presence before I even reached my door, a prickle of awareness on the back of my neck, an unshakable certainty that something waited for me inside. By then, paranoia had sunk in. Deep every noise from a neighbor's apartment made my pulse spike. I started scanning the small peephole in my door multiple times a night, expecting to catch someone or something lurking on the other side. Yet it was always just that empty hallway lit by the same flickering bulb. The persistent illusions of footsteps continued to haunt me. Sometimes I'd wake to a noise so loud I was sure I'd find my living room turned upside down. Racing out of bed muscles, twitching with adrenaline, I'd discover nothing out of place. Only that dread-laced corridor light burning when I knew I had shut it off. At one point, I considered speaking to the building manager. However, the conversation never got very far. He was polite but dismissive, muttering that the building was old and odd. Noises were common. He said something about the pipes or the wooden beam settling. I didn't mention the footsteps specifically because I was afraid I'd sound unhinged. Part of me wondered if I was in fact going insane. The stress was wearing me down. My hands trembled, even in daylight. My mouth felt chronically dry. I caught myself holding my breath in anticipation of the next flicker or noise. Eventually, I decided to do a thorough cleansing of the apartment one weekend. I scrubbed the floors, wiped the windows, and cleared out the clutter, hoping to purge whatever dark energy I felt had settled there. Despite my best efforts, the atmosphere remained oppressive. In the middle of the afternoon, when sunlight was streaming through the windows, I heard what sounded like a soft knock on the corridor wall. My heart lurched. The knock came again, 3 firm taps, then silence. I stood there holding my breath, waiting for something else to happen. Minutes passed in an agonizing hush, but no other sounds followed. By the time the sun set. The sense of foreboding returned with renewed intensity, as though annoyed by my attempt to chase it away with bleach and mops. My dreams, when I managed to slip into restless sleep, were plagued by bizarre images, hallways that stretched on for miles, doors that led nowhere or opened to reveal infinite darkness, flickering lights that popped and sparked raining hot embers that never quite touched the ground. I'd wake up drenched in sweat pulse hammering, only to discover the corridor light shimmering beneath my bedroom door, casting a slim beam of unstable illumination into my room. On multiple occasions, I remember launching from the bed to yank the door open, expecting to catch an intruder, but the hallway was always empty, the bulb overhead swaying slightly in a breeze I could never feel. At times, I questioned my sanity. I wondered if my job stress had manifested into psychosomatic experiences. Maybe I was projecting my anxieties onto the apartment, but how could I explain the lights that insisted on turning themselves on, or the electrician's baffled expression when everything checked out? Fine, the rational part of me kept trying to offer explanations, but the mounting terror in my gut refused to subside. My nervous system was in constant overdrive, heart-pounding hands, shaking stomach, twisted in knots. One particularly harrowing night, I was jolted awake by a series of loud bangs like heavy fists slamming against the living room walls. I rushed out of bed, every muscle in my body tense and rigid. My throat felt as though it was closing up, and a thin film of sweat coated my forehead. Approaching the living room felt like stepping into a nightmare. The corridor bulb was in one of its flickering cycles, casting a strobing effect along the walls. In that uneven light, I saw a distortion in the corner of the living room, as if the shadows there were shifting. My pulse thundered in my temples. The shadow swelled, coalescing into a darker shape, then abruptly vanished. I stood frozen, heart-pounding so furiously that it drowned out all other sounds. I realized I couldn't stay there much longer. My body was running on fumes and my nerves were shot. By then I could barely function at work. My thoughts kept drifting back to the apartment's mysterious phenomena. That sense of being watched never left me, as if a pair of eyes lingered just behind every door. The flickering lights had grown more erratic sometimes, in sync with my own sharp intakes of breath. As if reacting to my fear, I felt trapped, pinned down by forces I couldn't understand. 2 days later, I decided to spend the night at a friend's place. I needed some distance, some clarity of thought. My friend asked why I looked so pale, so exhausted, so on edge. I tried to explain, but the words sounded feeble. Footsteps, flickering lights, a sense of being watched. He listened politely, but was skeptical, though he did mention that sometimes old buildings carry strange histories. He offered me his couch and told me I needed rest. I was grateful for the reprieve for the first time in weeks. I managed to sleep without jolting awake in terror. Yet even in a different location, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was attached to me during the night. I dreamt of that corridor with its flickering bulb and peeling wallpaper. I dreamt of the door to my apartment opening on its own, revealing nothing but blackness inside. I woke in a cold sweat, my heart hammering when morning came. I felt no better. Reluctantly, I returned to the apartment. The following afternoon, I told myself I had to face it, or I would never live in peace. The hallway was oddly quiet as I walked in. The corridor bulb for once was steady, no flickering. The living room lamp too seemed normal. My tension peaked because the calm felt unnatural, like the hush before a thunderstorm. I spent the afternoon packing up a few essentials, deciding I would stay at my friend's place again for at least another night or two when evening fell. I turned on the lights for a brief moment. Everything remained still. My heartbeat gradually slowed and I exhaled a shaky breath. Then, as if on cue, the corridor bulb began to pulsate again. The living room lamp followed suit, dimming and flaring back up. I stepped into the hallway, trying to steady my trembling limbs. My throat felt raw and tight and my mouth turned bone dry. That was when I felt a rush of cold air sweep through the corridor. The overhead light flickered more intensely, casting the walls in a rapid succession of bright and dark. My pulse raced, and a faint buzzing filled my ears like static on an old television. In that throbbing glow, I glimpsed something move at the far end of the hallway, a swirl of shadow that formed the vague outline of a person my lungs seized. I wanted to run, but my legs felt anchored to the floor. Despite my fear, I forced myself to take a single step closer. The figure appeared to shift, dissolving into the wall before emerging again further down near the living room door. My heart pounded so brutally I thought I might pass out. I felt a wave of nausea and an overwhelming urge to scream, but my voice caught in my throat as I inched closer. The flickering reached a frantic rhythm and my vision wavered like I was on the verge of blacking out. I could smell something damp and metallic in the air, a scent that made my skin crawl. Something in me snapped. A primal surge of adrenaline jolted my limbs into motion. I lunged for the front door, heart slamming in my chest. Breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't dare look back, convinced I'd see that thing looming behind me if I did. My hand fumbled with the lock, sweat making it hard to grip the metal. The corridor bulb popped, plunging the hallway into darkness for a heartbeat, before sputtering back on in a shower of sparks. Finally, the door swung open and I stumbled into the building's main hallway, nearly colliding with the opposite wall. I don't think I ever felt such overwhelming relief and lingering dread simultaneously. I stood there, hunched over, hands on my knees, gasping for air. I could feel my entire body shaking from my shoulders down to my calves. If anyone had stepped out of their apartment at that moment, they would have found me drenched in sweat, eyes wide with terror, looking like I had stared into the depths of something unfathomable. Leaving was the only option that felt right. Over the next few days, I arranged to terminate my lease. The building manager gave me a hard time, but I didn't care. I never spent another night in that apartment. Instead, I moved into a modest place across town, more expensive, smaller, and far less convenient. But for the first time in weeks, I slept with the lights off, with no strange footsteps or flickering bulbs to torment me. Even now, late at night, the memory of that flickering corridor light can make my pulse quicken. There's a sense that I brushed up against something beyond my understanding, a presence or force that lingered in that apartment like a living stain. I often lie awake haunted not by the possibility that it followed me, but by the terrifying notion that it was never just the building's past or faulty wiring. Some places simply hold on to echoes of energies best left undisturbed, and I had been unfortunate enough to stumble right into one of them. I avoided that block in the city center for a long time. The few times I passed by in daylight, I felt a cold tingle slide along my neck as I glanced toward the windows of that old apartment. Even from a distance, I half expected to see a flicker of light behind the glass, and each time my heart would stutter in my chest, reminding me of what I left behind and of the darkness that no amount of modern electricity could ever fully chase away. It began with a feeling, an itch at the back of my mind that I couldn't scratch, a faint electric buzz in the stillness of my own home. The basement had always been an afterthought, a dull space for spare tools and old boxes, somewhere to stash what didn't fit upstairs. But now, every time I walk by the closed door leading down those old wooden steps, something clenches inside my chest. I feel my heart flutter, my breath catch in my throat. The very air around me seems charged, as if the house itself is bracing for something to happen. I never used to feel that way about my own home. It's supposed to be a place of safety, of quiet nights and comfortable evenings. Yet here I stand, gripped by a silent, unrelenting sense of unease. I remember how it started, though. I can't pinpoint the exact moment the shift began. Before, I used to joke around that there might be some hidden presence in the basement. Whenever I needed to grab a hammer or rummage through old boxes, I would stand at the top of the stairs with a sarcastic grin and say something like, "I dared whatever lived down there to show itself." It was a tease, a lighthearted poke at all the ghost stories I'd heard growing up. I never believed there could be anything real lurking in the shadows of that cramped concrete space. It was just me, my tools, and piles of dusty junk. Then came the night that changed everything. I was organizing shelves in the far corner of the basement, trying to make sense of decades worth of clutter. The single overhead bulb cast a weak glow that barely reached the walls. I remember how the darkness pressed at the edges of the light, how it felt like it was eagerly waiting for any slip in my attention for a time. Nothing unusual happened. I moved boxes around, coughed at the clouds of dust swirling in the stale air, checked my phone for the time the place smelled of damp concrete and rusting metal. My breath sounded unnaturally loud down there, echoing in the gloom. At some point, I felt the concrete floor under my boots vibrating so faintly I doubted my senses. It was like a tiny tremor, as if something massive had shifted far below my arms, broke out in goosebumps, and I felt a sudden chill that made my stomach lurch. I tried to shrug it off, telling myself it must have been a passing truck or a random quake, although I couldn't recall the last time I'd felt so much as a tremor in this region. My mind fumbled for logical explanations, but no matter how I tried to justify it, a trickle of dread had already begun creeping into my thoughts as I continued to sort through a box of old wrenches. The metal shelves along the wall gave a gentle, unmistakable rattle. Nothing dramatic, just a slight, almost polite shaking of the brackets. Yet it felt deliberate, as if someone or something was testing my reaction. I froze, every muscle going rigid. My pulse throbbed in my ears, and the dryness in my mouth made me gulp. My eyes darted around the basement from corner to corner, seeking any movement in the dark. The overhead light flickered, and my breath got shallow. Moments later, a small ring of metal keys which I had hung on a hook slipped to the floor with a sharp clang. The sudden noise made my heart lurch into my throat. It was such a simple event, keys falling, but in the charged atmosphere of that basement, it felt like the final straw. My skin felt prickly sweat trickle down my neck, and I realized I was trembling as the final echo of that metallic clang dissipated. I could have sworn I heard something else, something like a breath or a low hiss. It was too faint to be sure if I wasn't just imagining it. That alone was enough to send my panic into overdrive. My rational mind insisted it was all coincidence, an unsteady shelf, a loose hook, an overactive imagination. But fear flooded my body, pounding in my chest. I didn't even bother to pick up those keys. I dropped everything, turned, and bolted for the stairs. My hand shook so badly I fumbled twice with the doorknob at the top before managing to fling it open. Then I rushed out, slammed the door behind me, and found myself panting in the hallway, sweat cooling on my forehead. Despite the warmth of the night, I stood there listening, half expecting to hear footsteps or something heavier following me. There was only silence that night. I couldn't bring myself to go back down. In fact, I avoided it altogether for days, maybe weeks. I lost track because I forced my mind to push that unsettling memory away. But the basement refused to let me forget. Subtle reminders began cropping up at odd hours late at night. When I was trying to sleep, I'd hear a gentle tap, tap, tap coming from behind the basement door. Sometimes it was so soft I convinced myself it was just the house settling. But other times it came with a distinct rhythm, like knuckles rapping on wood. My heart would skip a beat, sweat would break out on my palms, and I'd lie there wide-eyed, staring at the door as if it might burst open at any moment. I told myself I was being silly. I'd think about how I used to scoff at ghost stories and people who claimed to sense presences in the dark. I was practical, grounded in reality, yet every time I woke up in the dead of night to those knocks, my body betrayed me. I couldn't slow my breathing. I felt my own pulse thudding in my temples. A sour taste of dread filled my mouth, and more than once I imagined the door handle rattling. I never worked up the nerve to check something in. Me insisted that if I opened that door at 3 a.m., I'd see something that would unravel my sanity. The worst was how the paranoia leaked into my everyday life. Even during the day, I found myself glancing over my shoulder when I walked past a mirror, worried I might catch a glimpse of something behind me. The house felt colder. The walls seemed to press in on me. I stopped sleeping well, plagued by nightmares that blended the basement with strange shapes creeping in the darkness. My hands would tremble while making coffee in the morning, and more than once I spilled half the mug on the floor. I kept telling myself it was just stress, that everything would be fine if I focused on more mundane tasks. Yet a persistent tension coiled in my chest, a quiet voice warning that the basement was more than just a storage space. Now it was infected with a presence I had invited on one particularly restless night. I heard a single deliberate thud against the basement door. My heart jolted so violently that my arms went numb. I lay in bed, paralyzed, uncertain if I'd truly heard it or if my mind had conjured it from half-leap. Then another thud came, heavier and slower. I imagined in horrifying detail some shape pressing its weight against the other side of the door, testing it. My scalp prickled, and I fought the urge to get up, to bolt outside, to do anything but remain there. Frozen sweat gathered at my temples, trickled down the sides of my face, and I realized I was gripping my sheets so tightly my knuckles ached in the morning. I tried to muster the courage to at least check the basement door for any signs of damage. My heartbeat refused to settle, and my mouth was desert dry. I stood at the threshold, hand hovering near the door doorknob, expecting it to jolt under my fingers. The door looked the same, no scratches or dents. But when I finally opened it, I noticed a stale odor drifting up, more pungent than before. It was a combination of damp concrete rust and something else, a musty, almost earthy smell that made my stomach churn. The darkness stretched below, and the bottom of the stairs was consumed by shadow. Even with the overhead light switched on, the gloom felt thicker, as if the basement swallowed most of the illumination before it reached the floor. I couldn't bring myself to go any farther than the first step. My entire body tensed with each breath, and my knees felt weak. I closed the door again, promising myself that I'd only go down there once I felt braver, though I suspected that moment might never come. Still, life had to go on, at least on the surface. I tried to keep up with work and daily errands. I avoided mentioning the situation to anyone, though a colleague asked once if I was feeling okay. Noticing the dark circles under my eyes, I mumbled an excuse about not sleeping well, about having too much on my mind. Inside, I felt the slow gnawing of fear that had become my constant companion. Even mundane moments felt charged. I'd jump at the sound of a drawer closing too hard, or the hum of the refrigerator at night. My shadow on the walls took on menacing shapes in my peripheral vision. My mind began to distort ordinary sights and sounds, weaving them into a tapestry of dread. Eventually, curiosity or desperation got the better of me. I decided I couldn't let myself be ruled by an empty basement. One weekend afternoon, determined not to be a prisoner in my own house, I steeled myself to go down there. The sunlight streaming through the living room windows did bolster my courage slightly. I told myself that daylight would keep anything at bay, that it was probably all in my head anyway. I armed myself with a flashlight, even though the basement had an overhead bulb, and stepped onto the creaking wooden stairs. Each step felt like a betrayal of my own instincts. My throat tightened and the flashlight shook in my clammy grip. At first, all seemed quiet. The glow from the bare light bulb overhead cast long, distorted shadows across the walls. My dusty shelves stood silent, the clutter on them appearing unremarkable, but my pulse hammered mercilessly in my chest and the sweat beaded on my brow as I moved deeper into the basement. I caught a glimpse of movement at the edge of my vision. Something black and indistinct darted behind a shelf in the corner. I nearly dropped the flashlight, my breath hitching in my lungs. Stepping closer, I tried to see if there was anything there, a rodent perhaps, or just my imagination. All I could make out was the rough concrete wall and some stacked boxes, but the air felt colder around me, pressing against my skin as if it had weight. I tried to calm myself by organizing a few tools, wiping down some surfaces, yet every so often I heard faint rustling sounds. Sometimes they seemed to come from the far side of the room. Other times from directly behind me. My head whipped around more times than I cared to admit, and each time I found nothing but empty corners. My breathing grew labored and my vision blurred at the edges. With the adrenaline coursing through my veins, I was on the verge of bolting back upstairs when a soft vibration rocked the shelves again. It wasn't violent, more like a pulse that resonated in the concrete floor. My stomach lurched and the flashlight beam swayed wildly with my trembling hand. A quiet scraping sound reached my ears. It came from near the foundation, low to the ground, as though something was clawing the concrete from the other side. I felt my insides twist into knots. My mind raced with all sorts of explanations, pipes expanding wind through a crack in the wall. Maybe an animal scratching, but the noise had a deliberate rhythm, a kind of slow, deliberate scrape, pause scrape. My vision swam and I nearly lost my balance for a moment. I questioned my grip on reality. Was I losing my mind, or was there truly something in this basement? That creeping sense of doom became overwhelming. My limbs were shaking so hard that I couldn't keep my flashlight steady. I imagined something monstrous on the other side of that wall, dragging its nails along the concrete, waiting for an invitation or a moment of weakness to break through it. It was pure insanity, yet it felt more real than anything I'd ever experienced, unable to endure. Another moment in that oppressive atmosphere. I stumbled toward the stairs, tripping on the last step and smacking my knee against the edge of a box. Pain flared, but it barely registered through my panic. I lunged for the door, slammed it shut behind me, and pressed my ear against the wood. My chest felt tight, and I sucked in air with audible gasps. I heard only my own pounding heartbeat, but I couldn't shake the certainty that if I lingered even a second longer, I'd feel something on the other side pressing back from that day. On the sound of knocks, thuds, and subtle vibrations grew more frequent, even if they were faint. My ears caught them like nails on a chalkboard. Each event chipped away at my composure, driving me to the edge of paranoia. I began to suspect that some entity had indeed responded to my careless mockery. Maybe not a tangible ghost or demon, but a presence conjured by my own mind. Either way, it was powerful enough to invade my thoughts, twist my perceptions, and rattle the foundations of my sanity. The days blurred together in a haze of anxiety. I wondered if I should move out, hire someone to seal the basement, or consult a paranormal investigator, though the idea of explaining all this to a stranger made my stomach knot with embarrassment. Meanwhile, the nights were the worst. I stayed in my bedroom, lights on, straining to hear even the smallest sound. My body was always tense, ready to flee at any sign of movement. Sometimes I thought about how ridiculous this was, letting a basement reduce me to such a fearful state, but the dread was no less real. Finally, I reached a breaking point late. One night I heard the unmistakable sound of the door to the basement rattling as if something was testing it. My body seized up and for a moment I couldn't breathe. Then I forced myself to stand. Adrenaline blazing in my veins, I grabbed a flashlight and approached that door again. My hand quivered on the knob, sweat gathering on my upper lip. My mouth was so dry I could barely swallow. The house was silent, but I felt the weight of whatever was behind that door pressing into my consciousness. I turned the knob. The door gave a slight creak, goosebumps erupted across my arms. There was a pregnant hush, a static-like pressure filling the space around me. For a heartbeat, I considered slamming it shut and never opening it again, but something in me needed resolution. I cracked the door open just enough to let the flashlight beam pierce the darkness below. The stairs were empty, the overhead bulb swaying gently without any breeze. The sense of being watched nearly made me collapse, yet no shape, no face revealed itself. I realized I was muttering under my breath, half a prayer, half an apology forever. Provoking whatever dwelled in the basement, my pulse thundered in my ears and my hand shook so badly that the flashlight flickered up and down the stairs. I felt close to delirium, convinced that if I waited long enough, some horrifying figure would step into that narrow cone of light. But nothing did. My resolve faltered and I slammed the door shut again, fighting the urge to scream. My lungs burned with frantic breaths and I wondered if the floor might give out from under me with how violently my body shook. Standing there, hard on the brink of bursting, I realized that this presence, whether real or in my head, was not going to vanish. It had latched onto my fear, grown stronger with my every tremor. I might never truly be rid of it. Even if I moved away, I suspected the haunting sensation would follow me, echoing in every silence, lurking in every shadow. My attempts to dismiss it had only tightened its grip on my psyche. I stayed up until dawn that night, listening to the house breathe around me, waiting for the next knock or scratch. None came. The stillness itself felt ominous. Like the calm eye of a storm when the first rays of sun finally broke over the horizon. I had a single disturbing realization. The basement had become a mirror of my own fears, a place where my mind's darkest anxieties could take form by daring something unseen to appear. I had opened a door that might never fully close. I haven't slept well since every moment in this house feels charged with an electric tension, as though something awaits the next misstep. I haven't gone back into the basement. The door remains shut, though I can't ignore its presence. Sometimes I hear a slight rattle or a muted thump, and each time my heart leaps into my throat, I'm caught between confrontation and surrender, between rationality and sheer terror. The house is quiet now, but that quiet is not comforting. It's loaded with a promise that the worst is yet to show itself in the end. All I can do is endure. I don't know if I'll ever truly find peace here again whenever night falls. The dread creeps back cold and relentless. My heart pounds just from walking past that door. My body tenses with the memory of shaking shelves and falling keys. The tension feels endless, a silent occupant that shares these walls with me in every knock in the night. Every subtle vibration reminds me that once you invite something unseen to reveal itself, you can never really send it away. The horror remains waiting in the darkness below. Knew something was off. The moment I first stepped into that corridor, it was the single path from my bedroom to the kitchen, a narrow stretch of creaking floorboards and wavering shadows that twisted in my periphery. Even on that first night, I felt it, a prickling at the back of my neck, like a chill seeping from the walls and tapping against my spine. I told myself it was just the age of the house, just the way old wood can moan and sigh in the night. But deep down, I suspected there was more to it. Something unseen hovered in the corners, waiting for me to pass. My colleague Brian insisted we take this rental because it was spacious and had character. He liked the vintage wallpaper, the arched doorways, the sprawling backyard. I was less enthused, but the rent was cheap and it was close to work. The landlord had no tragic stories to share, no rumored hauntings or ghastly legends. He called it a stately heritage home and left it at that. Brian moved into the larger bedroom down the hall while I took the smaller one right beside that corridor. I quickly learned that the hallway itself was the biggest drawback every time I walked through. My pulse throbbed in my ears. My stomach clenched as if expecting a confrontation with something just beyond sight. It started subtly, barely noticeable at first. One evening I swore I heard a sigh in the darkness. Another time I heard what sounded like gentle footsteps. They were never loud enough to be sure. I could always explain them away as the house settling, or perhaps Brian wandering around in the living room. But there was an underlying disco, a sense that the corridor itself was hungry for attention. The hair on my arm stood on end whenever I had to pass through, and my skin felt clammy as if the atmosphere there were colder and thicker than anywhere else in the house. Brian didn't admit to feeling the same unease. He would shrug when I brought it up in a roundabout way, telling me everything was fine, that I needed to relax. I remember him saying in a casual tone that old houses always came with strange sounds and drafts. He also joked that maybe I had an overactive imagination privately. I wondered if I was just more sensitive or if I was genuinely losing my grip on reality. Even when I tried to brush off my concerns, the next trip down that corridor would reignite all my fears. My teeth would clench involuntarily, and the weight in my chest felt like a block of ice pressing against my ribs as weeks went on. The experiences intensified. It wasn't just the sounds anymore. I started noticing shapes in my peripheral vision, something dark and still, just standing there at the edge of the light, always gone. When I turned my head, sometimes it looked like a figure about my height, a smudge of shadow that felt profoundly wrong. Other times I sensed a presence looming behind me. My heart would pound so hard I could hardly breathe. My palms became slick with sweat, and I had to fight the urge to bolt for the kitchen or retreat to my room. The corridor was merciless, demanding attention, even when I tried to ignore it. One night after finishing a late shift, I returned to the house, exhausted, eager for a quick meal before collapsing into bed. Brian's door was closed, but a faint glow leaked from beneath it. He was likely still awake. The rest of the house was dark and silent, except for the incessant groaning of the old pipes. As I crossed the threshold into the corridor, I felt an immediate drop in temperature. My breath came out in short, tense puffs, each exhalation sharpening my senses to a razor's edge. There was a tremor in my arms, as though my body was warning me to stay away. Yet I forced myself to move forward. Halfway through the corridor, I heard a definitive step behind me, a single deliberate press of wood underfoot. I froze, my pulse throbbing in my temples. The entire corridor felt more confined, like the walls were leaning in. Slowly, I turned my head, expecting to see Brian, or maybe my own shadow cast strangely, but there was only darkness, a cold, uncanny emptiness that made my stomach twist in knots. I stood there, unable to blink, until a second footstep echoed. It was close, uncomfortably close, and the air around me grew thick with dread. My lungs burned as I forced myself to breathe. That moment stretched on taut as a wire about to snap. I felt my knees threaten to buckle, yet some primal instinct commanded me to run. I bolted for the kitchen, nearly crashing into the fridge. My heart hammered like a wild drum, and my fingers fumbled to switch on the overhead light. Even in the fluorescent brightness, my chest was tight. I steadied myself against the counter, swallowing past a desert-dry throat. I was convinced something was still behind me, lingering in the corridor, craving my fear over time. The house itself started to feel like a trap. Doors would creak when no one was there. Windows would rattle even on windless nights. And the corridor, always that corridor, seemed alive. I began avoiding midnight snacks or any late-night trips through that space. If I needed water, I would wait until morning. My sleep became restless, haunted by half-formed nightmares of something whispering in my ear, something pressing on my chest. When morning came, I was greeted by an oppressive fatigue that followed me throughout the day, making it hard to focus at work. Brian seemed oblivious, or he pretended to be brushing off my concerns with a dismissive laugh or a pat on my shoulder. Whenever I tried to voice them, my paranoia grew. I started to question my own sanity. Was I conjuring these horrors in my mind? Perhaps my stress levels were too high, or maybe I was experiencing some form of mild hallucination, but the sensations were too real. The goosebumps that crawled up my arms were all too physical, and the racing of my heart felt genuine. Every single time I approached that corridor, I could sense something anticipating me, as though it had learned the rhythm of my life in the house and waited for me to cross its path. One evening, after wrestling with my thoughts, I decided to test myself. I sat at the edge of my bed, watching the corridor through a narrow gap in the door. I wanted to prove that there was nothing there, that the illusions only materialized when my mind was tense. But as I stared into the gloom, I detected movement. A fleeting shift in the darkness, as though the shadows congealed for an instant and then separated. My heart slammed against my ribs and a tingle of electricity coursed through my limbs. The corridor looked different in that moment, more distorted, as though the floor stretched longer than usual and the walls loomed closer. I nearly called out to Brian, but stopped, recalling how little help it had been before. Instead, I closed my door, locked it, and slumped to the floor. Trembling, my skin was clammy with sweat, and my lungs felt tight. A pang of nausea gripped my gut. I kept hearing the memory of that faint sigh and the soft thump of phantom footsteps. It was impossible to rest when I finally crawled into bed. Exhaustion weighed me down, yet fear kept my eyes wide open. The corridor became the epicenter of my anxiety, an ever-present reminder of something intangible but undeniable. Not long after, the nightmares intensified. Some nights I swore I could hear voices just outside my bedroom door, as though muffled shapes were congregating in the corridor, speaking in low, urgent tones. Their presence felt invasive. My tongue would go dry, and my body would be seized by a pins and needles sensation that left me momentarily paralyzed. When I finally mustered the courage to open my door, I would find the corridor empty. Its floorboards as quiet as a grave. Each time my fear deepened and I started doubting my senses even more. Was it possible that the house itself was feeding on my dread? Eventually, Brian noticed my jumpiness. He asked if I was feeling all right, mentioning I looked like I hadn't slept. I told him indirectly that something was off about the hallway and that I needed a break from the house. He suggested I go for a walk or maybe stay with a friend for a couple of days. I could hear concern in his voice, yet he never admitted to feeling that same oppression. There was no direct mention from him that he was aware of any presence lurking in the shadows. Whenever he passed me in the corridor, he seemed perfectly calm. I hated that it felt like the house singled me out, like I was the only one who could sense this intangible force. That night, I made a decision I would confront it, or at least try to. Standing at the doorway of my room, I forced myself to stare down the corridor without blinking. My heart thudded against my chest so violently that I felt the pulse in my throat. I breathed in shallow gasps, fighting the urge to close my eyes. The corridor was dark, except for a faint glow from the kitchen lamp at the far end. The distance between me and the kitchen seemed greater than usual, as though the house had stretched itself into some twisted labyrinth. With each slow step, the floorboards groaned beneath my feet, and the atmosphere grew heavier. It felt like walking underwater, each movement requiring immense effort. My ears picked up the faintest shuffle behind me, but I refused to look back. Cold sweat trickled down my temples, and my vision flickered as anxiety started to overwhelm me. My instincts screamed at me to run back to my room and lock the door. Still, I pressed on, determined to uncover whatever was haunting me around the halfway point. The air pressure changed, my ears popped, and a strange static hiss buzzed in my head. I had the sudden impression that something was leaning in close, brushing against the back of my neck. An involuntary shudder racked my body, and I nearly stumbled forward. My lungs burned with the effort to maintain composure. That was when I glimpsed it. The distinct silhouette to my right, not a fleeting blur this time, but a solid shape, a humanoid darkness that stood there silent and unmoving. My mouth went bone dry. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to flee, but a stubborn part of my mind insisted I hold my ground. I turned my head. Slowly, heart pounding so loud it felt like a drum in my skull, and finally faced it. The thing was only a few paces away, motionless. I could see no features, no face, just a concentrated void where a person might be. Its presence exuded a strange resonance, as though it distorted the air around it, and then in a single heartbeat it was gone. The corridor was once again empty. My breath came ragged and harsh. My vision blurred with terror and adrenaline. My whole body trembled, and I backed against the wall, pressing my palms to the cold plaster. I stood there for what felt like ages, trying to steady my breathing and slow the frantic beating of my heart. The realization washed over me. I hadn't imagined this. I truly saw something, and it saw me. I retreated to the kitchen, leaning heavily against the counter, heart still hammering my arms. Shook, and every breath felt like I was inhaling shards of glass. I glanced back at the corridor, an ordinary hallway, aged and unassuming, yet I knew it was anything but ordinary. Something was in there, something that fed on the dread it invoked. Brian found me in the kitchen, later, eyes wide and face pallid. He asked what was wrong, and I told him as calmly as I could that I had finally seen it. He looked at me with deep concern, suggesting I find help or talk to a professional. He assured me he would give me space to handle it. However, I needed part of me sensed pity in his tone, as if he thought my grip on reality was slipping. I couldn't bring myself to argue. Maybe I was losing it, or maybe something else was truly dwelling in this house, visible only to those vulnerable enough to notice. That evening, I made another decision. I had to leave. Whether I was imagining everything or not, I couldn't remain in that suffocating environment. My sanity was fraying with each passing day. I packed as many of my things as I could, ignoring the guilt over leaving Brian. My hands were unsteady and cold sweat dotted my brow. My breathing was shallow and my nerves felt like live wires under my skin. I kept hearing that same sigh echo in my head over and over, like a reminder that something lurked just out of sight on my final pass through the corridor, carrying 2 bags and an overnight case. I steeled myself. The floor creaked under every step, and I was painfully aware of the suffocating darkness brushing against my peripheral vision. My heart raced so violently that I tasted copper in my mouth. As I reached the far end, a sudden and overwhelming weight enveloped me, a pressure that made my knees buckle. I paused, breath stuck in my throat, convinced that if I turned around, I would see it standing just inches from me, perhaps leaning in with that featureless stare, but I didn't turn. I forced my leaden feet to keep moving until I crossed into the kitchen and out the side door. Once outside, I released a shaky breath. I didn't realize I'd been holding the night air felt almost warm compared to the corridor's bone-deep chill. My heart still pounded painfully and my body was coated in a clammy sweat. But I felt a liberation, however brief. There was an eerie sense of being watched through the windows, as though whatever was in the house might be peering at me from behind the curtains. I refused to look back. I got into my car, cranked the ignition, and drove off with my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I wish I could say that I found a neat conclusion or a rational explanation, but the truth is I still feel haunted by that corridor. Even now, my mind wanders to it in the dead of night, replaying the footsteps, the sigh, the silhouette. My dreams bleed with images of walls closing in, of a darkness that stands just behind my shoulder. That old house remains as it was unremarkable to most observers, yet teeming with a presence I cannot deny. And part of me wonders if it's out there waiting patiently for someone else to notice its quiet call in the darkness. When the wind blows late at night, I almost hear that sigh again, beckoning me to remember what I left behind, and to fear that it might one day find me again. I remember the first time it happened. The office lights were blazing fluorescent. The LED indicators on the servers glowed steady and calm, and the hum of modern technology filled the room with an oddly soothing undertone. It was the kind of environment that usually reassured me. No dark corners, no flickering shadows, just the well-ordered hum of expensive machines. But that morning, the day everything shifted, I felt an inexplicable tightness in my chest. The moment I entered, something about the air felt heavy, thick, as if charged with a subtle yet palpable energy. My heart began to pound, a quiet but insistent drum, and I couldn't explain why there was no visible threat. Nonetheless, my mouth went dry and a queasy anxiety bloomed low in my stomach. I work still do, though I question that choice sometimes. In an advanced tech firm, the main office is a large open space with rows of workstations, all of them outfitted with multiple monitors, high-powered desktops, and a tangle of wires. snaking under each desk floor to ceiling windows, let in plenty of sunlight, and overhead bright LED panels. Keep everything illuminated day and night. Adjacent to this open area is the server room, my domain a secure climate-controlled chamber filled with racks of state-of-the-art hardware. Normally, I find comfort in the whir of cooling fans and the rhythmic blinking of status lights. It was a predictable routine, the kind of environment where logic and data were supposed to prevail. Yet there was something subtly wrong that morning. As I walked toward the server room, I felt an odd static prickle on my arms, making the hairs stand up at first. I chalked it up to some weird change in humidity or maybe new hardware giving off an unfamiliar frequency, but deep inside I had an unsettling sense that something else was going on. It was as if the technology around me was listening or alive. In a way I didn't understand. That feeling made my skin clammy and my breath came in shallow gulps. I tried to calm myself, reminding myself that this was a place of science, not superstition. Things escalated later that day. I overheard a couple of colleagues in the break area discussing the upcoming Halloween season. They weren't telling ghost stories exactly, but they exchanged tales about strange occurrences in old houses, half laughing as they teased each other. A moment later, I heard a shrill beep. One of the servers had rebooted. Without warning, the LED lights throughout the office flickered just once, almost imperceptibly, but enough to make my heart skip a beat. My boss happened to be passing by at that moment, and he looked as startled as I felt. He dismissed it as a minor glitch, perhaps a power surge, and told me to check the system logs. I remember feeling both relieved and unsettled. Relieved because maybe it was just a technical hiccup. Unsettled because a small voice in my mind kept insisting it wasn't so simple. The system logs showed no errors, nothing indicated a hardware fault. No evidence of an update that might have triggered a reboot. It was as if the server had decided on its own to momentarily shut down. I felt a jolt of anxiety ripple through me, a hot flush that crawled along my neck. There was something deeply unnerving about equipment acting of its own accord with no explanation. I tried to focus on the practical aspect. Maybe there was a software anomaly or a cooling issue, yet a persistent chill sat at the base of my spine. As the weeks went on, these power surges and flickers became a pattern, always sparked by any conversation that veered into eerie or superstitious territory. A few co-workers joked that the office was haunted, though they mostly said it with smirks, but jokes became uneasy. Laughter once it became undeniable that these incidents coincided with those particular topics. My boss had me run diagnostics, bring in outside contractors, even swap out some of the power supply units on the servers. Every test result came back. Normal engineers told him there was no plausible reason for the recurring reboots. Meanwhile, I began to notice smaller details that felt impossible to ignore. A subtle static in the air whenever someone mentioned anything about ghosts, curses, or omens. The fine hairs on my arms would lift and the LED panels would dim, then return to full brightness as though exhaling my own reaction bordered on panic. Each time the phenomenon repeated itself, I grew more tense. My heart would race, the pulse throbbing in my temples. My breathing turned shallow and I fought back the urge to question my sanity. One late afternoon, I stayed behind to check cabling in the server room. The door closed behind me with a soft hiss, sealing in the whine of fans and the cool climate-controlled air. I tried to concentrate on the wiring, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. Every so often, I would jerk my head up, certain I had seen a shape flit across the corner of my vision. Each time there was nothing there, just rows of silent servers and their tiny LED indicators. I confided in a colleague, let's call him Derek, about my unease. He told me with a sympathetic half smile that he too felt a strange electric tension in the office. Whenever people talked about inexplicable things, he confessed he had begun avoiding any mention of legends, horror movies, or even superstitious jokes because it almost guaranteed a flicker in the lights. I felt both validated and more afraid this wasn't in my head alone. My palms dampened with sweat when I realized the phenomenon was consistent enough that multiple people were noticing. Still, most of the office dismissed it as a bizarre coincidence, or at least tried to. My boss insisted on a rational explanation, though he never specified what that might be. He simply believed a physical cause existed and would eventually be found. The tension between wanting to trust him and wanting to flee from whatever unseen force was building in that space ate away at me. My anxiety soared at night. I would catch myself reliving the day's events. Heart pounding in the dark of my bedroom. Mind spinning with possibilities. The day I started losing sleep was also the day I started losing trust in my surroundings. One evening, after everyone else had gone home, I stayed behind to review the logs again. I couldn't let it go. I sat at my desk in that open workspace illuminated by the cold glow of overhead LEDs. The silence pressed in on me, thick and oppressive. My own breath sounded unnaturally loud, and I could hear the blood pumping in my ears. My heart hammered so forcefully I thought it might burst from my chest, determined to find some clue. I combed through line after line of timestamps and error messages, and then it happened. One by one, the LED panels overhead started to pulse in a slow rhythmic pattern like a stuttering heartbeat. My computer screen flickered in the reflection of the black monitor. I saw movement behind me, just a suggestion of a silhouette, something small and swift. I whirled around, but the space was empty. My scalp tingled and cold sweat trickled down my temple. The dryness in my mouth was unbearable. I tried to call out, thinking maybe security was behind me, but my voice stuck in my throat. Then out of nowhere, the servers in the next room began to cycle. Up and down fans spinning faster, then slowing almost as if they were breathing. The hum changed pitch, a rising and falling moan that made my stomach twist in fear. I forced myself to approach the server room. Each step felt like walking through molasses. My lungs tightened and I fought the urge to run in the opposite direction as I opened the door. The lights above flickered more intensely. A wave of dizziness hit me as the flickering synchronized with my pounding heartbeat. For a few seconds, I lost track of time. I couldn't tell if I'd been standing there for moments or hours. The entire room seemed to pulsate. I felt certain I was on the verge of some horrifying revelation, like the veil of normality was about to be ripped away, but then just as abruptly, everything stabilized. The lights returned to their steady glow. The server fans worried back to their regular drone. My chest heaved with panicked breaths, and I realized I was soaked in sweat. The next day, I told my boss the basics of what I'd seen. He looked concerned, but still insisted there had to be a rational explanation. Maybe I was under stress or experienced a momentary hallucination brought on by working late. My mind reeled. I had always been logical. I had never believed in poltergeists or psychic fields or anything that couldn't be explained by science. Now I was caught between wanting to believe him and the terrifying sense that something intangible had taken root in our office over the following weeks. My mental state deteriorated. I began to doubt my own senses. I would be typing an email and my peripheral vision would catch fleeting shapes near the servers. My neck would prickle as if someone stood right behind me. I started to notice a faint buzzing in my headphones, like whispers layered beneath the standard office noises. During a routine check, I tried to monitor the electromagnetic levels in the server room, wondering if some abnormal interference was at play. The readings jumped sporadically whenever I so much as thought about the flickers. I couldn't even mention them out loud without the needle spiking. This link between thought and phenomenon was terrifying. Like whatever was causing the disturbances could read my fear. My breathing turned ragged just at the idea. Paranoia set in. Each morning I dreaded entering the building. My chest would tighten the moment I crossed the threshold, and the smell of burnt electronics would haunt me even if no one else noticed it. Simple tasks became burdensome because I was always on edge, anticipating another flicker, another glitch. I avoided talking about anything even remotely superstitious, but it didn't matter. The tension in the air had matured into a constant oppressive weight. Coworkers began to notice that I looked pale and jumpy. Some quietly asked if I was all right, but I could see the uncertainty in their eyes, as though they suspected I might be unraveling. Sometimes I felt surges of anger or desperation, and the lights would respond with a brief blink, as if the entire system was acknowledging my distress. At those moments, I could hardly breathe. It became impossible to separate my fear from the swirling undercurrent of energy that seemed to saturate every device in the office. My heart often felt like it was clawing its way out of my chest, and I would taste bile at the back of my throat. One late night, with almost everyone gone, I decided I needed to confront whatever was happening. I sat down in the darkened office, the only illumination coming from the distant glow of streetlights and the soft LEDs on idle computers, taking slow, measured breaths. I forced myself to speak out loud, not caring if anyone else heard. I asked whatever was in that space to show me a sign to make me understand. My voice trembled and my lips felt numb, but I pushed the words out. The silence that followed seemed to expand a hollow vacuum of anticipation. Then gradually I felt the atmosphere shift. It was as if the entire building inhaled. The overhead lights began to pulse again, but more faintly this time, like a gentle heartbeat. The servers in the adjacent room came alive with a low resonance that vibrated through my bones. I realized with a jolt of panic that the phenomenon was responding to me. My lungs felt too small and cold. Sweat trickled down my back. Despite the overwhelming terror, there was also a strange sense of connection, as though I was bridging a gap between the tangible and the intangible. It felt like I was being urged to accept something horrifyingly beyond normal comprehension. Then it just ended. The lights returned to normal and the servers quieted to their usual operational hum. My entire body shook and I almost collapsed. There was no definitive answer, no clear message, just this impression that the entity or force or whatever it was had acknowledged me. I stood there trembling, uncertain whether this was more horrifying or more reassuring. The next day I told my boss that I had a solution. I would do my best to ignore the phenomenon and ensure no one in the office discussed anything related to horror superstition or paranormal events. He seemed taken aback but didn't argue. There was an unspoken pact among some of us to avoid. All mention of those subjects for a time, the flickers subsided. The reboots became less frequent, but the tension never really disappeared. It was like living with a coiled snake under the floorboards. Maybe it wouldn't strike if we tiptoed around it, but we all sensed it was still there. My sanity remained fragile on the surface. I appeared functional, doing my tasks and assisting colleagues internally. I was a trembling mess of nerves and paranoia, always expecting the next surge of energy. The slight crackle of static from a monitor or an unexpected beep from a server could send my heart into a frenzy. My nights were plagued by insomnia, replaying every glitch in my mind, questioning if I was the cause or the victim. My body constantly ached from the tension. My mouth stayed perpetually parched, as if I could never quench a deeper thirst, some primal need for security that was no longer attainable over time. I realized I couldn't stay in this suspended state of vigilance forever. Something had to give. I began planning to take a leave of absence, hoping that distance might loosen the invisible grip that office held on me. I wasn't sure if physically leaving would help, but I felt I had to try before finalizing that plan. I decided to check the logs one last time to see if there was any definitive proof of an external force. When I did, I noticed a pattern I had missed before each event was timestamped, exactly after someone mentioned fear or superstition. The correlation was absolute down to the second. It wasn't just random, it was synchronizing with our words. That knowledge made me feel both validated and deeply afraid. On my last evening in the building before my planned leave, I walked through the office alone, pausing to listen to the faint hum of electronics and the subdued hum of the air conditioner. The overhead lights glowed softly. My chest felt tight, but this time I also felt a ripple of determination. Under my fear, I approached the server room, placing a hand on the door. The metal was cold to the touch, but a weird warmth pulsed beneath my palm like a hidden current. I whispered an internal farewell, acknowledging whatever presence lurked there. My heart pounded, but I felt a sliver of resolve. Sometimes acceptance is the only way to lessen the terror of the unknown that was 2 weeks ago, and I'm still trying to process what happened. I haven't returned to the office yet. My boss messaged me indirectly through a text so I wouldn't have to hear his voice tremble, that things have been stable. No more flickers, he said. The place feels oddly subdued, as if an electrical weight lifted part of me. Wonders if my own presence was fueling it, feeding that intangible force with my mounting anxiety. Part of me worries that eventually I'll have to go back and everything will start again. The thought of stepping inside that building makes my stomach lurch. I keep replaying the final moments that charged silence before I left, when it felt like the entire space was holding its breath. I can't shake the idea that it was letting me go rather than me escaping it. Sometimes late at night I swear I sense static in the air at home, or see a light flicker momentarily in my peripheral vision. It makes my heartbeat thunder in my ears. Every nerve in my body braces for the possibility that I brought something home with me. I haven't found a neat explanation, no official diagnosis, no scientific justification. All I know is that the office's environment became a mirror of our fears. It thrived on them in its own silent, pulsing way. Whether it's truly gone or simply biding its time, I can't say, but the uneasy truth remains. Some things respond to our minds and our deepest dreads in ways logic can't untangle, and that is perhaps the most terrifying realization of all. That sometimes the more we question, the darker the shadows become. I first felt it in the pit of my stomach, a cold, nauseating twist that turned my normal commute home into a nerve. Rattling gauntlet, it was the sensation of unseen eyes drilling into my back each evening. As I crossed the parking lot, I sensed a presence lingering behind me just out of sight. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was nothing more than an overactive imagination sparked by a run of late nights and job stress. But deep down, I knew better. The feeling was too strong, too persistent, and it was about to become much worse than I ever expected. My name is Alan, and a few months ago I started noticing that one of my co-workers, Melissa, had developed an unusual interest in me. At first I brushed it off as a friendly attempt to get to know someone on the same project. She would approach me during lunch breaks, ask questions about my hobbies, and even laugh a little too enthusiastically at my half-hearted jokes. It felt harmless, if a bit cloying. I was used to office camaraderie, and her attention seemed fairly normal, but soon odd details piled up. Repeated attempts to sit beside me in every meeting, frequent run-ins at my locker, and a habit of lingering outside the conference room. Whenever I worked late, I started to get that subtle, prickling sense of being watched, even when my eyes were focused on the computer screen. During those early weeks, I reassured myself that coincidences happen in offices all the time. People often drifted to those they found interesting or had some shared interest with. But there was a darker current in the air that I couldn't define. My palms would grow clammy when she was around. My breath would quicken at her approaching footsteps each time I opened my email. I half expected to see her name in my inbox, and of course I did. Constantly, she would send me messages about the smallest things, a stray comment in a meeting, a shared reference to a movie I had casually mentioned, or even random greeting cards wishing me a pleasant afternoon as if we were close friends. The messages themselves were not threatening, but their volume and tone were off. They arrived so frequently that I would get 2 or 3 in a single workday, typically signed off with an overfamiliar "take care of yourself," or "I'm always here." If you need to talk over time, I noticed that she started asking personal questions, but not in a friendly way. She wanted to know where I liked to hang out after work, which restaurants I frequented, and whether I lived alone. It began to feel intrusive, but I had no evidence of actual wrongdoing. Everyone else in the office regarded Melissa as an overly helpful team member, someone who was always volunteering to pick up extra tasks. Nobody seemed to notice anything amiss, and so I rationalized that I was overreacting. I tried to keep my distance without being impolite. That approach failed spectacularly. One evening I was at a small bookstore near my apartment, a place I visited often to unwind. I'd never told her about it. I like to think of it as my secret refuge from the daily grind. I was flipping through a novel in the dimly lit aisles, lulled by the mellow smell of old paper. When I caught a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision, I glanced up and saw her at the end of the aisle staring straight at me. My heart hammered and my mouth went instantly dry. She offered a strange smile that didn't reach her eyes, then came closer, holding a book she claimed was on her reading list. She said something about having stumbled upon the bookstore by chance, though her tone suggested she wasn't being entirely honest. I felt my pulse throbbing at my temples and a thin sheen of sweat broke out on my forehead. Instinct urged me to get away, so I mumbled an excuse about needing to run errands. As I headed out the door, my hands trembled so violently that I struggled to fit my key into the car's ignition. From that point on, it was as though she had discovered the blueprint of my life. She began popping up at my favorite cafe arriving. Just as I was about to leave, sometimes I spotted her car in the grocery store parking lot parked 2 rows behind mine. More than once I looked out my apartment window at night and thought I saw her silhouette on the sidewalk illuminated by the sickly yellow glow of a street lamp. Each time my heart pounded against my ribs and a chill raced down my spine. I tried telling myself I was just paranoid that I was misunderstanding her intentions, but then it escalated in a way I couldn't ignore. One afternoon I found a small note tucked beneath my windshield wiper. The words were written in neat cursive, instructing me to look behind you next time. My entire body tensed as if an icy hand had clamped onto my neck. Though the message was short, it radiated a creepy possessiveness, like she was daring me to acknowledge her constant surveillance. Soon more of these notes began appearing, always brief but undeniably unnerving. I saw you leave late last night. You never answer my emails quickly. I know you're reading this. Each discovery brought a fresh spike of dread, and my stomach knotted at the thought of how she always seemed one step ahead, perfectly aware of my daily routines. Around that time, I also realized she had photos of me that I had never sent her a coworker, commented that Melissa showed them pictures of me at some office event, but I had no recollection of giving her those images, and the coworkers swore they were taken outside the office. I checked my phone, thinking maybe I had posted something on social media, but these were candid shots, grainy images of me at my apartment building inside the bookstore and even sitting alone in my car. The angles were bizarre, as though captured from behind half-closed doors or across dimly lit streets. My breathing shallowed and my palms grew clammy at the realization that she was cataloging my private moments. I tried to confront her indirectly by hinting to a mutual colleague that I was uncomfortable. The colleague assured me that Melissa was just being friendly and maybe needed some reassurance or kindness, but kindness was the last thing on my mind. Every time I felt her presence, a surge of fear flared in my chest, leaving me shakier than before. My concentration at work began to deteriorate when I typed emails. My fingers sometimes shook, causing me to hit the wrong keys. My nights became restless, filled with half-waking nightmares of hearing footsteps outside my door. One night I was sure I heard soft knocking on my apartment walls. It was past midnight and the quiet hum of my refrigerator was the only background noise. Then came a faint rhythmic tap. My heart seized in my chest and I swallowed the rising panic. I forced myself to check my windows and door adrenaline pounding in my ears. I didn't see her, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was somewhere close, watching my breath. Came in fast bursts and my skin felt clammy. I remember standing in the center of my living room with the lights turned off, feeling as if my own home had turned into a hostile territory in the darkness. Every shape seemed menacing. I imagined her lurking in the shadows, waiting to step forward and claim me for her dark obsession. Strange things began to happen at the office too. Several times I would come back to my desk after a meeting and find my chair repositioned or my computer screen left on some random file I hadn't opened. My coworkers barely noticed my unease, shrugging it off when I mentioned it, but each instance cranked my anxiety a notch higher. I started to doubt my own senses had I left the chair in a slightly different position. Maybe I opened that file by accident. This creeping self-doubt made me question every thought that crossed my mind. Soon I couldn't tell if the illusions were real or just fabrications of my own paranoia. Lights in my apartment flickered at odd times. Doors seemed to cack open on their own. I caught glimpses of movement in mirrors, like a figure slipping out of view. Just as I turned my head, my heart would race so violently that I felt dizzy and I'd grip the edge of a table to steady myself. The wood pressing into my sweaty palms, the more I tried to ignore these sensations, the more pronounced they became. It was as if a parasite had crawled into my mind, warping every shadow into a potential threat. One weekend I tried to escape. I drove to a nature trail a few towns away, believing I could calm my nerves in the fresh air and distance myself from whatever was happening. For the first few minutes it worked. The gentle rustle of leaves, the sunlight filtering through the branches, everything seemed tranquil. Then I heard a twig snapping behind me. My pulse raced and cold sweat formed on my temples. I froze. Listening another soft crack, I spun around to see a figure vanish behind a tree. My chest felt like it was being crushed by an invisible vice. I rushed back to my car and my foot pressed so hard on the gas pedal that I almost sped off the dirt road. Even out here, I realized I couldn't escape her presence. The fear had followed me when I returned to my apartment. There was a note taped to my door longer than the previous ones. It demanded that I meet her at a small cafe that evening. It threatened to share certain private photos with coworkers if I refused. My vision blurred for a moment and I had to steady myself against the doorframe. My breathing was shallow and my heart thudded in my chest so loudly I imagined it echoing in the hallway. This had crossed a line into blackmail, and I felt dread creeping up my spine. My mind raced with questions. How far would she go? Would she break in while I was gone? Was she capable of actual violence? I knew I couldn't handle this alone. The next day I confided in a trusted friend, describing the situation in hushed, shaky tones. They urged me to file a report, or at least contact someone in HR. I did both, albeit hesitantly. HR gave me generic advice about setting boundaries and offered to speak with her if necessary. The police noted my statements but explained they needed clearer evidence of wrongdoing. My friend suggested I stay over at his place for a while. I agreed, stuffing the most important belongings into a duffel bag and leaving my own apartment in a hurry. For a week I slept in my friend's cramped guest room every night, jolting awake to the slightest noise. Even there I had nightmares about her standing at the foot of the bed, her figure silhouetted in the flickering streetlight, whispering my name. My friend said I sometimes woke him up with frantic shouts. Though I had no memory of doing so, I was on high alert, and the anxiety was eating away at my sanity. I tried to maintain my routine, going to work and checking in with HR, but the idea of seeing Melissa by the water cooler or worse alone in the hallway made my heart pound uncontrollably. Eventually, the company took the allegations more seriously. She was asked to avoid direct contact with me unless absolutely necessary for work. For a short while, things seemed to calm down, but the tension in the air was still thick, an electrical buzz that set my nerves on edge. Every time I walked past a corridor, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder. Every ring of my phone filled me with dread. On one particular evening, I stayed late to finish a deadline. The entire office floor was nearly deserted, illuminated by cold fluorescent lights that left large swaths in half shadow. My eyes itched from hours staring at the screen, and the thick silence was interrupted only by the hum of the air conditioning. I sensed a presence behind me so distinct that the hairs on my neck stood on end. I spun around, half expecting her to be there. Nothing. A wave of relief trickled through me, leaving my muscles slack and trembling. But then behind the partition, I caught movement. I heard a soft shuffle, like a shoe scraping against the carpet. My pulse spiked, and for a few seconds I was too terrified to move, gathering whatever courage I had left. I crept forward, every step as cautious as if I were crossing a minefield. As I rounded the partition, I saw a shape in the dim corner, someone crouching. My heart battered my ribs and I stifled a gasp. But before I could speak or do anything, the shape darted out of sight, disappearing into a corridor that led to the emergency exit. I stood there uncertain whether to follow. My body felt paralyzed by fear, a cold sweat drenching the back of my shirt. I decided not to pursue. Instead, I packed up my laptop in a frantic rush. My hand shook so badly it took 2 attempts to zip my bag. The entire time I expected to feel a hand clamping onto my shoulder. My breath rasped in my throat and I could taste the metallic tang of panic. I left the office practically sprinting to my car. Once inside, I locked the doors immediately, feeling my heartbeat throb in my ears. I sat there for a moment, drenched in adrenaline, scanning every window and shadow for any sign of movement. Then I started the engine and drove away, I decided that night I had to make a drastic change. I spoke with HR once more, contacted the authorities again, and on the advice of a security consultant began the process of transferring to another city office. My routine changed as well. I altered my driving routes, varied my supermarket runs, and stayed off social media. Altogether, paranoia had become a constant companion, but slowly I felt a small measure of safety returning. After a few weeks of careful planning, I officially transferred out. I never saw Melissa again, at least. Not face to face yet. To this day, I'm haunted by a lingering sense that she never really let me go. Sometimes late at night, I hear a faint tapping on the walls of my new apartment, or I catch sight of a vaguely familiar figure in reflective surfaces. I feel that same oppressive presence in empty hallways as though I'm still being watched. My heart leaps into my throat each time my palms go slick with sweat, and I can't help but remember every horrifying moment of her fixation. The question still gnawed me. What was she truly capable of? Was it all an elaborate stalker's game, or was there something more, something beyond mere obsession? I wish I had a definitive ending to this story, but all I have is the uneasy truth. I managed to escape her immediate reach, but I never escaped the fear she planted in my mind. When I lock my door at night, I double-check it, triple-check it, convinced that if I let my guard down for even a moment, I'll find another note, or catch a silhouette drifting past my window, that sensation in the pit of my stomach. The cold twist of dread, it never fully went away. And the worst part is that sometimes I'm not sure if I hear her footsteps in the hallway or if it's just the echo of my own terror following me wherever I go. I first realized something was wrong the night the motion-activated lights in my apartment corridor flickered in tandem with my own heartbeat. It was past midnight and I was just returning from my shift at the supermarket. Those lights always turned on when I passed by, but that evening they blinked and buzzed, creating a staccato effect that made me feel as though I was stepping into some dreadful stage performance. My chest tightened, the air felt thick. Even the silence around me seemed charged with a heavy, menacing energy. Something in me knew the darkness outside my door was no ordinary darkness. It felt watchful and oddly intimate. I remember unlocking my door with shaky hands, the key scraping against metal sounding louder than it should have, and that was just the beginning of a long, unnerving experience that made me question every previously solid aspect of my existence. I have always been a cautious person by nature, never one to take unnecessary risks. Working as a cashier at a local supermarket seemed low-key enough for my temperament. I like the routine, greeting customers, scanning items, making polite small talk, and then moving on to the next person in line. Occasionally, I would get the usual rowdy customer who demanded a discount or complained about prices, but there was a certain comfort in the simplicity of my job. At least that's what I used to think the first time I noticed the man was on a Monday afternoon. I was busy sorting out my register as the supermarket had just opened. He was standing at the end of my lane, not picking out any items, just waiting. There were other cashiers already open, but he didn't seem interested in them. He appeared to be in his late 40s with pale skin and a thin frame. His eyes were an unsettling shade of gray, and he stared at me with what I initially perceived as eagerness. I rang him up quickly, noting that he only purchased a small pack of gum and a bottle of water. I tried to dismiss. People are odd. Sometimes I thought maybe he just liked my line for some innocent reason, but he came back the next day, and the day after that, he was always there. The moment I opened my lane, regardless of what time I started, if I had to take a bathroom break or help out in another section, I would see him shuffling around the store, glancing at the magazines or frozen foods, waiting for me to return. At first, his behavior was more off-putting than frightening. I tried to convince myself that he was just a friendly guy with a weird way of showing it. Yet every time he approached the checkout, my pulse quickened. I couldn't place why something about his demeanor went beyond simple friendliness. Perhaps it was the way his eyes locked onto mine, never wavering or blinking enough, or the way he made a point of leaning in too close, whispering casual remarks under his breath. While I scanned his items, he started asking questions about my day. That in itself wasn't alarming. Customers do that, but his inquiries quickly became more personal. He wanted to know where I lived, if I lived alone, if I had a partner, what kind of car I drove, and which route I took to get home. My responses were curt and guarded. I attempted to deflect by asking if he found everything he needed, or if he wanted to use a store membership card. He would smile as though we shared a secret and imply that he didn't need any membership card, because he always made sure to come to my line. Specifically, the way he said it with that conspiratorial tone made the hair stand up on the back of my neck one evening. After a particularly long shift, I felt utterly drained. I closed up my register and headed out to the parking lot. The day had been cloudy, and by the time I stepped outside, the night sky looked almost purple. The streetlights cast an eerie glow on the wet asphalt. Then I saw him. He was leaning against the hood of my car, arms crossed as if we were old friends meeting for a late-night chat. My stomach lurched and a wave of cold sweat broke across my forehead. He greeted me by my first name, even though I'd never told him what it was. I recall feeling my legs tremble. My breath got caught in my throat and my vision blurred for a moment, as though reality had decided to tilt, just enough to make me queasy. He began talking about how he had seen me leave the store alone every night, and how he worried about me, wanted to make sure I was safe. I couldn't bring myself to meet his gaze. I mumbled an excuse about needing to get home quickly and brushed past him. Opening my car door with unsteady hands, he stood there without moving an inch, his stare drilling into me the moment I got in my car. I locked the doors and drove off, glancing in my rearview mirror the whole time he stayed in the same spot watching me. Until I turned out of the lot. Over the next few days, my sense of dread intensified. It became apparent that he wasn't just a pushy customer, he was actively tracking my schedule. No matter what shift I took, he'd show up within minutes of me opening my register. If I tried to switch lanes or run a quick errand away from the checkout, I'd see him skulking in some corner, pretending to look at canned goods or reading nutritional information on the back of a cereal box. I told my supervisor I was feeling uncomfortable with a particular customer's attention. She suggested I change shifts to avoid him, which I eventually did, but it didn't help for long. A few days after changing to a later shift, I caught a glimpse of him through the glass doors just standing there. He walked inside the moment he saw me start to ring up customers. My mental state deteriorated at night. I found it difficult to sleep. I'd lie in bed, heart pounding so loudly that my eardrums throbbed. Every slight noise in the hallway, footsteps, doors clicking shut, water running through the pipes made me bolt upright. I checked the locks multiple times, sometimes pacing around my apartment for an hour or more. Too uneasy to rest, my reflection in the bathroom mirror became gaunt eyes ringed with purple shadows. A testament to my mounting paranoia, I began to sense a presence in my apartment. Small signs that someone or something else was there. A door slightly ajar that I knew I'd closed. A misplaced mug, a light turned on when I was sure I had shut it off at first. I blamed exhaustion and stress, but the coincidences piled up to a point where I no longer felt they could be mere accidents one night. As I was drifting into a restless sleep, I heard a sound in the living room like someone running a fingernail across the wall. My entire body locked with fear, my throat tightening as though an invisible rope was choking me. I told myself it was the building's pipes or the old wooden floors settling, but the sound repeated, almost methodical, reminding me of someone lightly tapping or scratching. Just enough to be heard, I leaped out of bed, grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand, and forced myself to look around. Nothing was there, but that didn't comfort me. In fact, it made things worse. The emptiness of the room felt loaded with threat, as if something intangible hovered in the corners, watching and waiting in the daylight. I tried to rationalize my fear. I told myself that the man was just a stalker, a run-of-the-mill creeper who had latched onto me for some inexplicable reason. Yet as time went on, his presence seemed to grow beyond mere physical stalking. There were moments in the supermarket where I felt his gaze on me before I even spotted him. The edges of my vision would blur and my chest would constrict when I whipped my head around. I'd see him in an aisle leaning to the side to peer at me, or standing behind a display shelf, always too far to speak, yet too close to ignore. Sometimes I caught faint reflections of him in shiny surfaces, windows, mirrors. Even the metal backing on the inside of the candy racks at the store, it became a twisted game of hide and seek, and I never felt I was the one seeking. Instead, I was perpetually aware of being the sought. My boss told me to remain vigilant and not to engage. I considered going to the police, but I couldn't pinpoint anything overtly illegal. He hadn't threatened me verbally, he just existed in my space constantly. That in itself was terrifying enough to feel like a threat, but I worried the authorities would brush me off as paranoid. One particularly rainy evening, I stayed late to restock shelves. The thunder outside echoed through the store, and the fluorescent lights overhead flickered now and then, which only amplified my anxiety. I was alone in the aisles, trying to speed through the last bit of work, when I heard the soft hum of footsteps behind me. My body responded with a jolt, racing heart, clammy palms, a sharp intake of breath. I turned around slowly. It was him standing at the other end of the aisle, half shrouded in the shadow cast by a defective light. He didn't speak. He just stood there. My mind churned with questions about how he got in after closing, but I was too terrified to voice them at that moment. Something cold and electric passed through me. It was like a static charge multiplied tenfold. The overhead lights flickered more intensely, and for a split second I thought I saw his face distort, jaw stretching wider than any human jaw should, eyes sunk deep into sockets that looked hollow and endless. My stomach dropped as if I had fallen from a great height. When the light stabilized, his face seemed normal again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had glimpsed something beyond normal human expression. I thought I might be losing my mind. I backed away slowly, feeling the sting of tears. I refused to let fall. My body was torn between wanting to run or freeze. Somehow my survival instinct kicked in just enough for me to force my legs to move. I half walked, half ran toward the employee exit. The entire store felt uncanny and warped, as if the aisles were stretching. A dull ringing sound filled my ears, and the rhythmic pounding of my heart seemed to sync with the flickering lights. When I reached the exit, I fumbled with my keys and nearly dropped them twice before I managed to unlock the door. I didn't glance back. I didn't want to see him see it again. After that night, I told my supervisor that I couldn't continue working. The same shift, I demanded a change to the early morning slot, even if it meant drastically cutting my hours. Any time of day that might keep him away seemed like the only lifeline I had left. My boss agreed, though she gave me a concerned look. I sensed she thought I was on the verge of a breakdown. My first morning shift passed without incident. I began to believe maybe I'd evaded him, that he wouldn't show up at 5 in the morning just to stand in my lane. Then, toward the end of my second morning shift, as the sun was fully up, I noticed something pinned to the windshield of my car. It was a small note with a scribbled message telling me it was nice to see me bright and early. My hands shook, my throat went dry. I scanned the parking lot, but I saw no sign of him. However, my relief was short-lived, because that sense of being watched came roaring back. A prickling across my skin that made me feel both cold and feverish. At the same time, things escalated further when I began finding footprints outside my apartment door, a single set of wet shoe prints that stopped right at my entrance. Some days I heard quiet shuffling near the door when I was inside, when I looked through the peephole. No one was there, but I could sense a presence just out of view. My paranoia spiked to unbearable levels. I started second-guessing everything. The reliability of my senses, the possibility that I was conjuring these things out of intense anxiety, yet the unshakable feeling of external menace was real enough to keep me up at night. I started sleeping with a chair jammed under the door handle and a flashlight clutched in one hand. The final straw came one afternoon as I was leaving the store. The sky was unnaturally dark, almost as if a storm was ready to burst overhead. Any second I had just clocked out and was heading toward my car when the air around me seemed to thrum with tension. My breathing grew shallow and my palms broke out in a cold sweat. I scanned the parking lot, no sign of him. Relieved, I walked a little faster, then I heard it. The most faint whisper, almost lost under the whoosh of distant traffic. It sounded like my own name, repeated in a soft, taunting tone. My heart hammered in my chest as I spun around, but I saw only rows of parked cars, and a single flickering lamppost. That lamppost in that moment looked like a crooked figure with an outstretched neck. My vision swam, and for a second I thought I saw the silhouette of a person hunched behind a car. But when I blinked, the shape was gone. I forced myself to get in my car and drive. As I sped away, I became convinced that someone was in the back seat with me. I could feel a presence so tangible that I broke into a fresh sweat. My breathing turned ragged, each inhale stinging my lungs. I glanced in the rearview mirror, fully expecting to see him, but I was alone still. I could not shake the sensation that he was there in some intangible, possibly supernatural form. When I reached my apartment building, I rushed inside and locked the door that night. As I sat in the dimly lit living room, I came to a disturbing realization. Maybe he had never been just a person, or if he was, maybe my fear had given him a power beyond ordinary stalking. I recalled every surreal moment, every distortion of light, every flicker in which his face appeared to shift into something inhuman. Was it the product of my own unraveling psyche, or was there a genuine horror lurking under his skin? The boundary between rational explanation and paranormal threat had dissolved. I realized I couldn't keep living with this constant dread. I made the decision to leave, at least for a while, pack a few belongings, stay with a friend in another town, and consider never returning on my last night in that apartment. I heard more tapping on the walls, more whispers in the darkness. I packed my things to the sound of scuttling footsteps above my ceiling. Even though the apartment above was vacant, every hair on my body stood on end as I crossed the threshold for the final time, triple checking that I left nothing essential behind. The corridor lights flickered out as I passed, drenching everything in complete darkness for a few agonizing seconds until they popped back on, revealing no threat, just an empty, musty hallway. Still, I felt watched. I drove away just before dawn, feeling both foolish for running and relieved for taking action. My heart pounded relentlessly and a tension headache throbbed at my temples. Yet I found a small measure of comfort knowing I wouldn't be there for him to find. The next time he came lurking around, whether my terror was purely psychological or if there was something more sinister at play, I couldn't be sure, but my gut told me I made the right choice. Even now, settled in a borrowed apartment 2 towns away, I can't fully relax at times in that space between wakefulness and sleep. I think I see him standing at the foot of the bed on stormy nights. I recall the flickering lights and sense him in every corner of the room. My heart rate spikes, my palms grow clammy, my mind drifts to that place where rational thought dissolves under the crushing weight of fear in those moments. I wonder if I escaped him at all, or if by surrendering to my terror, I somehow brought him with me, a specter conjured by dread. The uncertainty gnaws at me, constantly leaving me wide awake and trembling until the first rays of sunrise cast the room in a feeble light that feels less like safety and more like temporary reprieve. I keep telling myself it's over, that I'm safe, that he, whatever he is, won't find me again. But deep down, a persistent chill in my bones reminds me there are things in this world that don't rest just because you run from them. And every time I catch my reflection in a darkened window or see a half-hidden figure from the corner of my eye, my heart sprints, and I remember the way his eyes bored into me as though he saw not just my face, but something far deeper. Something vulnerable and primal within the memory alone is enough to keep my pulse racing well into the night. And even as I sit here recounting the details, I swear I feel that electric static in the air. Again, the flicker of lights that I can't quite confirm are actually flickering somewhere in the darkness. Maybe he's still waiting, maybe just behind my mind's peripheral vision, ready to step forward to reclaim the terror he sweat in my life. And that realization, that precarious uncertainty, leaves me with a queasy dread that refuses to fade, haunting me long after the last word of this story is spoken. I remember the exact moment when the silence on that lonely stretch of highway first felt wrong. The road seemed to stretch infinitely, like some dark ribbon leading me away from sanity. My shift at the hospital had been brutal. 14 hours tending to people on the brink, their moans echoing in sterile hallways while fluorescent lights hummed with that sickly buzz by the time I signed out. Exhaustion weighed on my shoulders like a lead vest. Driving at that hour was supposed to offer peace, Instead, it became a gateway to one of the most harrowing experiences of my life. The night sky was a gaping void, refusing to share starlight or even a hint of moon-on-glow headlights illuminated only a narrow swath of tarmac, leaving the periphery swallowed by shadows that seemed to writhe and shift. Whenever I glanced at them, I was used to that tired trick of the eyes. Exhaustion often creates illusions in the dark, but there was a density to these shadows, an almost sentient mass that pressed against the edges of my vision. A mild drizzle coated my windshield, forcing me to lean forward and squint at the road ahead. The rhythmic squeak of the wipers was the only accompaniment to the engine's soft hum. Every so often I fiddled with the radio out of habit, static a crackle, then silence again. The few stations that might have been broadcasting this late offered nothing but faint whispers of white noise. Normally, the hush would have soothed me after a day of chaotic emergencies and fluorescent corridors, but something in the air felt charged, as though the night itself wanted to speak. I forced a slow exhale to combat the tension creeping into my chest. My heart rate was steady but heavier than usual. Each beat resonating in my ears, I tried to shake off the unease by telling myself I was overt tired, but the hush persisted, pressing into me, turning the interior of my car into a claustrophobic capsule. My palms began to sweat against the steering wheel, forcing me to loosen my grip. Then I heard it, a voice low and urgent, as if it were slipping out from behind my seat. It was a single word, but it cut through the silence with an almost physical force, making my heart lurch. It demanded I accelerate. That voice was so clear it might have been a passenger sitting right behind me without even thinking. I slammed my foot on the gas tires, squealing as the car surged forward. Instantly, adrenaline spiked and the edges of my vision blurred. I clung to the wheel knuckles, white, trying to steady the car as I rounded a sharp curve. The back end swerved, nearly sending me skidding into a ditch, but I wrestled control and straightened the vehicle with a gasp that tore at my throat. My heart pounded so violently I could feel the echo in my fingertips. In a split second, the voice was gone and a deafening silence rushed back in. I was panting, my tongue dry and my mouth parched like all moisture had evaporated in the space of that single terrifying moment. My mind raced. Had I really heard someone in the car, or was it just an auditory hallucination produced by my exhausted brain? When I finally studied the car's speed and took a quick glance at the rearview mirror, I saw only empty seats, dark and featureless, yet the oppressive feeling that someone was lurking behind me refused to dissipate. I pressed onward, forcing my eyes on the lane ahead, determined to make it home. The tension in my muscles bordered on cramping, and I found myself leaning forward as if trying to escape my own seat. The rain picked up drumming on the roof, but that usual lullaby of droplets did nothing to soothe me. Every few minutes I caught myself scanning the rearview mirror, certain I'd see a shape or silhouette. My rational mind told me it was just nerves. Nonetheless, the skin on my arms prickled with goosebumps every time I looked. When I finally rolled into my driveway, relief fluttered weakly in my chest. I stepped out, my body trembling with unspent adrenaline. The late-night wind was cold, slicing through my jacket and making the hairs on my neck stand on end. Inside, the house was still and dark. The hallway lights were off, but that was expected. No one was there to keep them on. That emptiness usually felt comforting after chaotic shifts, but tonight it felt too large, too quiet, as if any breath or creak would ricochet off the walls and betray some presence. I didn't want to admit was there. For weeks after that night, I couldn't shake the memory of that voice. I told my colleagues indirectly about a strange experience, omitting details of hearing an actual whisper. Most said it was stress-related, the sort of hallucination that comes from sleep deprivation. A friend mentioned he once had a microsleep behind the wheel, dream imagery, bleeding into wakefulness. I wanted to believe them, yet every night on my way home, I felt the seat behind me as though it held an unseen occupant. I kept expecting that voice to return, commanding me with impossible clarity. Even in broad daylight, a sense of intrusion lingered. I'd be making coffee in my kitchen and suddenly feel like someone was watching from the window. The reflection in the glass never showed anything suspicious, but the skin on my back would prickle all the same. My shoulders grew tight, my posture stooped. I started to suffer from persistent headaches, thick pulsing pain that radiated from the base of my skull. At night, sleep was fractured by nightmares. I'd see myself behind the wheel, hearing disembodied whispers. Sometimes they told me to drive into oncoming traffic. Other times, they simply repeated my name over and over until I woke up drenched in sweat, gasping for air. Things escalated slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, one night driving home under a pale moonlight. Finally, the sky decided to show me some illumination. I thought I felt a shift in the car's weight, as though someone in the backseat had moved from left to right. My heart pounded so hard it hurt. I flicked on the overhead light. Nearly swerving in my panic, the back seat was still empty, but the uneasy heaviness remained over the following days. I noticed an odd smell in the car. It was faint but unpleasant, like singed hair or rotting leaves. No amount of air freshener or driving with the windows down could chase it away. Then the radio started acting up on certain drives. It would burst into static or flicker between stations, even when the power was off. Once I heard something like shallow breathing coming from the speakers. My chest tightened and my scalp tingled with a sensation akin to ants crawling over my skin. That was the same week my reflection in the rearview mirror began to betray me. Every so often I'd glimpse a face that wasn't mine. It was always too quick to fully register, but I caught the edges. A jawline sharper than my own eyes, set slightly farther apart, pale lips twisted in a grimace or a grin. I'd blink in terror and the face would revert to my own startled expression. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the overhead lights on the highway or the shapes of passing cars, but each time my rationalizations felt more hollow. My mouth would go dry, my entire body would break out in a slick cold sweat, as though I had the flu. Breathing became a labor chest, rising and falling with shallow, desperate gasps in those increasingly sleepless nights. I'd lie in bed listening to the house creak and groan. I heard the wind outside the distant bark of a neighbor's dog. Every sound seemed amplified, pounding into my heightened awareness. I felt pinned under an unseen weight, as though the voice I'd heard that night had latched onto me. Infecting my thoughts, I remember lying there, eyes on the ceiling, envisioning that spectral passenger crouched in the corner of my bedroom, silently urging me to fear everything around me. Even with the lights on, the corners remained dark shapes coalescing just beyond clarity. My heart hammered in my chest until it felt as though it would burst, yet I still had to keep working. Responsibilities don't vanish just because you're frightened or exhausted, so each evening I drag myself back to the hospital, run on autopilot through a barrage of tasks, then steel myself for the drive home. The dread of returning to that car built until the final hour of my shift felt more horrific than anything I'd dealt with in the emergency room. One particular night stands out. The day had been filled with the typical chaos, leaving me drained. It was around 2 a.m. when I finally trudged through the parking lot, each step feeling heavier than the last. When I unlocked my car, I heard a distinct click inside, like the door locks snapping into place, even though I just unlocked them. My pulse quickened. Easing the driver's door open, I slid into the seat and shut it behind me immediately. The interior light dimmed, I turned the key in the ignition, and for a brief moment the radio flared to life with a cacophony of howling static before going silent. I settled my hands on the wheel, forcing my breath to slow. My chest felt tight, as if an invisible vice was closing around my ribs. I tried to ignore the oppressive hush inside the car, switching on the headlights and creeping out of the lot. For the first 20 minutes, the drive was uneventful, the road devoid of traffic. I allowed myself to relax marginally, though my shoulders remained stiff. Then out of nowhere, the smell hit me, a pungent, acrid odor like burnt plastic. My eyes watered, my nostrils flared as my stomach churned. My first thought was that something under the hood was malfunctioning. I glanced at the temperature gauge. It was normal, but the stench persisted. Filling the car, my heart hammered. I felt a sensation of movement behind me again with a trembling hand. I adjusted the rearview mirror, my breath caught in my throat. Someone was in the back seat. Not a distinct figure, but a shape darker than the surrounding darkness. My eyes must have lingered a second too long because the car drifted onto the rumble strip. The roar of the tires on the uneven pavement jolted me back by the time I looked again. The seat was empty, though the burning plastic remained. My chest tightened with panic. Cold sweat slicked my forehead. My arms felt weak and I nearly fumbled the wheel. Then that same low voice that haunted me weeks before seemed to press against my ear. It wasn't an audible whisper this time, more a guttural presence in my thoughts urging me to speed up to abandon control. My foot hovered over the gas pedal, threatening to obey. I fought it, my mind swirling with images of the car spinning off the road or colliding with a guardrail. A wave of anger rose in me. Why was I letting this intangible thing push me around? I managed to keep my foot steady, refusing the silent demand to floor the accelerator. My lungs burned from shallow breathing. Every second felt loaded with the possibility of another intrusion. The voice or the presence or whatever it was seemed to flicker in and out of my consciousness. Adrenaline spiked with every flicker, but I refused to give in. I forced my eyes to the road, ignoring the mirror, ignoring the sense of being watched. I recalled a grounding technique someone at work once mentioned. Focus on the immediate senses. I took stock of the smell of my own sweat, the leather of the steering wheel under my fingers, the hum of the engine slowly. My panic receded enough to let me think clearly. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I slammed the car into park, cut the engine, and leaped out, letting the door swing shut behind me. My breath came in ragged gulps. The entire drive from hospital to home had felt like a balancing act between life and madness. I staggered to the front door, half expecting the porch light to flicker off or the lock to resist my key, but everything was normal. Once inside, I flipped every switch, bathing the hallway in a harsh, comforting glow. I couldn't stand darkness. Not anymore. For hours, I paced the living room, too wired to sleep, too shaken to sit still. My reflection in the window looked hollow-eyed, as if I'd aged a decade. In a few weeks, I couldn't keep living like this. Consumed by fear every time I got behind the wheel, part of me wondered if I should just quit my job, but that wasn't practical. Another part worried that I was losing my grip on reality. Was it stress, a psychotic break, or was there really something malevolent clinging to me? Eventually, I decided to confront it directly in my own way. I set aside the next day to thoroughly clean my car inside and out. I vacuumed every inch, scrubbed the seats, wiped down the windows, and sprayed disinfectant until the chemical smell overpowered everything else. I performed these tasks almost ritualistically, as though purging the vehicle of whatever darkness had nestled there. I even played music on my phone while I worked, hoping the lively tunes would drive away the oppressive silence. That evening, I approached my commute with tense determination. My heart pounded painfully, but I was resolute. I started the engine and let it idle while I took deep breaths as I pulled onto the road. A sense of unease enveloped me, but I felt a faint glimmer of something else, maybe defiance. The drive stretched on each mile, seeming to test my resolve when the radio flickered with a whisper of static. I turned it off when the smell threatened to creep into the vents. I rolled the windows down, letting the cold air sting my face. And when the sense of presence in the back seat surged, I refused to meet it in the mirror, keeping my gaze locked on the road. Somewhere along that route, an odd clarity arrived. It was like a switch flipping in my brain. I recognized that my fear fed this thing. Whether it was external or a product of my own fragmented psyche, the more terror I released, the stronger it became. So I focused on slow, rhythmic breathing, telling myself that supernatural or psychological, it had no right to control me. My heart was pounding, but there was a new steadiness in my hands by the time I reached the final bend near my home. I realized my breathing was almost normal, though beads of sweat still lined my brow. I felt more in control than I had in weeks. I still expected a whisper, a flicker in the rear view, but it never came. The air felt thick, but the stench was gone. The oppressive weight in the car seemed to have lifted, leaving behind only the faint hum of the engine and the quiet rustle of wind through the window crack when I parked in my driveway. The silence of the night was still unsettling, but it no longer felt like a threat. My chest still fluttered with residual adrenaline, yet I sensed something had shifted. Whether I had banished a genuine dark force or simply conquered my own mind, I wasn't sure. All I knew was that I had faced it, refused to be its puppet. As I stepped out of the car, I took in a shaky gulp of the cool air and let the tension uncoil from my muscles. Since then, I've continued my late shifts driving that same deserted road. I can't say everything feels normal. There are times when I catch a fleeting shape in the corner of my mirror or sense an unsettling hush behind me, but the voice no longer commands me. The presence, if it remains now, finds me harder prey. Sometimes I question if the entire ordeal was a manifestation of my own overworked, anxious mind, or if something truly unearthly latched onto my weariness that night. Either way, I carry that memory like a scar, a reminder of how thin the boundary between reality and nightmare can become even now. As I turn the key in the ignition after a grueling shift, I take a moment to steady myself. My heart inevitably thuds a little faster. My palms dampen on the steering wheel and the hair on the back of my neck prickles with that ancestral fear of the unseen, but I draw in a breath, release it slowly, and pull onto the road when the silence grows too heavy. I remind myself that I've already stared into the darkness and emerged shaken but unbroken. The night still has secrets, but it no longer has me. I still remember the very first instant I sensed that subtle but unmistakable chill along the narrow rural road. It wasn't the kind of cold one feels from a sudden draft or the night air. It crawled under my skin and clung to my thoughts, an almost tangible presence that made my breath hitch. When I recall that moment now, I'm convinced it marked the threshold between my ordinary life and something far darker, something that defies reason. Even now, thinking about it sets my heart racing, and I can practically feel the hairs on my arms standing on end. I walk that back road most weekends. It starts just a few miles from my house, winding through fields and patches of woods before looping around a wide meadow during the day. It's a peaceful place. Big sky, the earthy scent of tilled soil, the distant sound of crows calling. I've always found it calming to wander there, letting my mind drift away from work stress. But after the night I saw those lights, everything changed now. Even the thought of returning to that spot makes my breath quicken. My chest tightens at the memory of the way the air felt wrong and how my heart pounded so loudly I was sure it would echo through the quiet countryside. I had gone for a late evening stroll, something I often did when insomnia kept me awake. I like the hush of nighttime when the stars burn bright and the world settles into a slower rhythm. The moon was only a slim crescent. That night, barely illuminating my surroundings, the soft crunch of gravel under my sneakers and the brush of the occasional night breeze against the leaves were the only sounds I remember trying to focus on my breathing. Inhale, exhale, trying to let the day's tension melt away. It didn't work as well as I hoped, but I kept going, passing familiar fence posts and crooked trees that had become my silent companions over the years. Then I saw them, two small, intense lights darting across the road maybe 30 yards ahead. At first I thought they were reflections, headlights from a distant car, or the faint glimmer of fireflies, but they moved too deliberately, too quickly, gliding as though they were alive. I stopped walking, my footsteps grinding to a halt in the gravel. My pulse hammered in my throat and I could taste something metallic on my tongue as I swallowed. The lights hovered a few inches above the ground, crossing from one side of the road to the other in a fluid motion. I couldn't make out any shape around them, no outline of an animal, person, or machinery, just 2 points of brilliant white that sliced through the darkness as if they were charged with some strange energy. My instincts told me to turn around to head back home. I was no stranger to caution, and fear was already tightening my chest, but curiosity pushed me onward. The next few steps I took felt reluctant, as though my own body warred against me for venturing closer. Halfway to where I had spotted the lights, they simply vanished. No flicker or dimming one moment. They were there the next, they were gone. The night around me was suddenly too quiet, as though the world had hit a pause button. I strained my ears for any sign of life, an owl hooting, a breeze rustling the branches, but there was nothing that was. When the cold set in, it spread from the center of that spot outward like an invisible boundary. The hair on my arm stood up and I felt goosebumps prickle along my neck. My breath came out in a shaky exhalation visible in the air. Even though it was late spring and nowhere near freezing, I can't fully describe how unnatural it felt. It was as though the temperature dropped from mild to wintry in just a few seconds. My hands started to tremble and I clenched them into fists, trying to steady myself. I could feel my heartbeat pounding like a drum, reverberating in my ears. There was a moment, just a split second, when I was convinced I heard a whisper so faint I almost doubted I heard anything at all. It felt as if someone had murmured just out of earshot, sending a shiver skittering down my spine. I looked around, desperate to find a source to give it a rational explanation, but all I saw was the dark outline of trees on either side of the road and the open field stretching far into the distance. That night I practically jogged home, refusing to look back. My lungs burned with the effort and cold sweat slid down my temples, dampening my collar. Once I reached my front porch, I realized my hands were still shaking uncontrollably. I told myself I must have imagined half of it, that perhaps it was a trick of the moonlight. Maybe I was overtired or let my nerves get the best of me, but deep down I knew something was off. Over the following days, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. My sleep was restless, and I'd wake up with my mouth dry, heart thrumming as if I'd been running in my dreams. In an attempt to reassure myself, I mentioned my late-night encounter in passing to a neighbor, though I framed it casually and left out the unnerving details. The neighbors simply shook their head, said they'd never seen anything like it, and suggested it might have been a reflection from some new farm equipment. I didn't press the matter. Something about describing the experience in detail felt like I'd be opening a door I wasn't ready to face, but I couldn't resist the pull of that rural stretch, and the following weekend I decided to walk it again, this time right before sunset, so I wouldn't be in complete darkness. As I approached the spot where the lights had appeared, my heart began to race. The sky still had remnants of orange and pink along the horizon, and I could see enough to avoid tripping on loose stones. However, the closer I got, the more I noticed a kind of hush descending over the area. The evening chatter of birds seemed muted, and the wind that ruffled my hair just moments before felt oddly distant. I swallowed hard, tasting that familiar metallic tang on my tongue again. My breath grew shallow, a new wave of anxiety twisting in my stomach. I lingered there, scanning the ditch on both sides of the road. Everything looked normal. There was a drainage channel, a few patches of wildflowers, and old wooden fence posts leaning at precarious angles. Yet the tension in the air was palpable. It felt like standing on the threshold of a room where something lurks just behind the door. I was jumpy. Even the sound of a twig snapping under my shoe made me flinch. I half expected the lights to reappear, but that didn't happen. Instead, I felt this pervasive sense of being watched. It was almost oppressive, a sensation that made every muscle in my back tighten until I had to force my shoulders to relax. I left that evening before the last traces of sunlight disappeared, feeling uneasy and more confused than before. The following days, I couldn't stop thinking about that place. It was as though a part of me was trapped there, replaying the memory of those hovering lights in the unnatural cold. My appetite diminished, and I found my thoughts drifting at work, my hands trembling whenever I recalled the sensation of that quiet. I questioned my sanity more than once. Was I having some stress-induced hallucination? Was it possible for an overworked mind to create such vivid experiences? Eventually, I resolved to go back at night again, mostly to prove to myself that I was capable of walking that road without freaking out. I chose a Friday evening, telling myself that if it all went wrong, at least I wouldn't have to function at work the next morning. The moon was fuller this time, providing a bit more light, but it also created long, eerie shadows that stretched across the dirt like dark fingers. My breathing was shallow, and I noticed my palms were damp inside my jacket pockets. I tried to pace myself and keep calm, but with every step my pulse escalated. Halfway along the route, the tension rose. My ears began picking up indistinct sounds. Maybe just the wind and the grass, maybe something else. My mouth went dry, and I had to swallow repeatedly to keep saliva in my throat. The air felt thick, as though I was walking through an unseen web. Each footstep sounded too loud, echoing around me in the hush of the surrounding fields. In the distance, I could make out the silhouette of an old barn. I'd passed it countless times without giving it a second thought. but tonight it loomed like a monolith, a silent witness to my discomfort. When I finally reached that familiar stretch, my legs felt weak, and I had to fight the urge to run the road. Looked the same, but there was a wrongness hanging over it that made the hair at the nape of my neck prickle. I paused, straining to see if the lights would appear. My body tensed, bracing for something I couldn't name. For a long minute, everything was still, then the wind gusted and I heard a faint rustling in the ditch. It was probably just a small animal scurrying away, but it made my heart lurch. My breath came in quick, ragged bursts, and I had to remind myself to inhale fully before I passed out from fear alone. Suddenly, the temperature plunged again, just as it had before. One moment I was standing in the mild night air. The next, my skin was covered in goosebumps. I shivered and rubbed my arms, but it did no good. The cold bit into me deeper than any chill had a right to. The subtle wave of dizziness hit too, like a wave of nausea in my gut. I didn't see the lights this time, but I felt them, or something slithering just beyond my peripheral vision. Several times I thought I glimpsed a flicker at the corners of my eyes, only to whip my head around and find nothing. That was when I felt an unmistakable presence behind me. My entire body seized with terror, and I had to force myself to turn around. The road behind me was empty, bathed in moonlight and shadow. But the feeling of being watched, of something hovering just out of sight, was almost unbearable. I could hear my own heartbeat drumming in my ears, and each exhale sounded shaky. I thought about yelling, making some noise to prove I was alone, but something in me decided it was better to remain silent. Some primal instinct insisted that drawing attention would be a mistake. I'm not proud to admit it, but I bolted. Fear pounded through my veins and I sprinted. Nearly tripping over loose stones, my lungs burned and my vision blurred. From the adrenaline, I only slowed down when I reached the outskirts of my neighborhood, where streetlights and houses offered a semblance of normalcy. Once home, I was soaked in sweat, my clothing clinging to me as though I'd been caught in a storm. It took hours to calm down, and even then I barely slept the next day. I couldn't stop replaying the sensation in my mind. A part of me dreaded ever returning, while another part insisted I couldn't let fear claim a place I had once loved for its peaceful solitude. Over the ensuing weeks, I felt my nerves on edge whenever night fell. I started drawing the curtains earlier, double-checking that my doors were locked. Simple noises, a branch scraping a window, a gust of wind made me flinch. My rational mind told me I was being ridiculous, but the dread was too ingrained to ignore. I tried another tactic, returning in broad daylight. A few times I parked my car at the beginning of that road and forced myself to walk its length under the midday sun. Everything looked so harmless in the light, just a gravel path winding through farmland, yet even then I felt a twinge of unease. My heart would pick up speed as I neared that particular stretch, and though I didn't sense any dramatic drop in temperature, I couldn't quell the creeping paranoia that settled in my bones. One afternoon I stood there, forcing myself to remain calm and take in every detail. The curve of the fence line, the scattering of pebbles, the tall whispering grass. As I did, I had the distinct feeling that the place was studying me in return. The notion was irrational, but it nodded at me. My mouth went dry again and my fingertips tingled with anxiety. A crow caught from somewhere behind me and I startled, nearly stumbling as my heart slammed against my ribs. Over time, I started having nightmares in them. I'd be walking along that road and the two lights would appear, drawing closer and closer until I could see something swirling between them, an amorphous darkness that seemed to beckon me forward in the dream. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. I could only watch as the darkness pulsed. The sound I heard in these nightmares was a distant humming, like a chorus of voices just out of range, blending into a drone that made my ears ache. I'd wake gasping, my body slick with cold sweat, my mouth so dry it hurt to swallow. I reached a breaking point when I realized I was no longer functioning. Normally, my appetite was gone, replaced by a constant knot in my stomach. My hands trembled whenever I thought about the lights. My concentration at work suffered, and I found myself avoiding social calls. I didn't want to talk about it, couldn't explain it in a way that felt believable. The scariest part was that I wasn't sure I even believed myself, determined not to be ruled by this dread. I decided on one final confrontation. I would go back at night, stay as long as I could, and see if anything definitive happened. I prepared carefully, dressing in layers for warmth and bringing a flashlight with fresh batteries. My plan was to stand my ground. I wasn't trying to challenge anything. I'm not that foolish, but I wanted to face it to see if I could find any logical explanation. Perhaps if I confronted it head-on, I'd discover some mundane truth and my fears would dissipate. I arrived just before midnight. The night was cool but not cold. The sky clear and shimmering with stars. My flashlight cut a narrow beam through the darkness. Each step crunched on the gravel, echoing in a way that seemed unnaturally loud. By the time I reached that dreaded spot, my pulse was already racing and my breathing had grown shallow. I flicked off the flashlight, letting my eyes adjust to the moonlight. The silence pressed in on me like an invisible weight. Once again, I felt sure there were eyes on me, or something that passed for eyes hidden in the gloom. For a few minutes, nothing happened, and I felt the smallest flicker of relief. Maybe it really had been my imagination. Maybe I'd conjured this terror out of stress and sleepless nights. My heart rate began to slow. My breathing steadied then. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the faintest glimmer, a flicker of white nearly at ground level. My entire body seized with dread. The lights were back dancing at the edges of my vision. I forced myself not to move, though every instinct screamed at me to run. The temperature plummeted sharper and more brutal than ever before. My teeth chattered and I could feel my muscles contracting involuntarily. My flashlight suddenly died, plunging me into near total darkness. Panic surged through my veins, but I fought to keep control. Then came the hum, that low frequency I'd heard in my nightmares, vibrating in my chest and rattling my bones. It felt alive, scraping against the inside of my skull. I wanted to clamp my hands over my ears, but I was too terrified to move. I tried to speak, to ask what it wanted, but my voice caught in my throat. My lungs felt constricted as though something was gripping me from within. The lights flickered closer, small white orbs bobbing in the darkness, and for an instant I thought I saw shapes coalescing around them like swirling shadows. My vision blurred with tears, not from sadness, but from an overwhelming primal fear. Every nerve in my body was on fire, and then, as abruptly as it had started, it ended. The humming stopped. The lights disappeared. The temperature reverted to a normal, if not slightly cool night. My flashlight flickered back to life, beam cutting through the darkness once more. My body was shaking, my knees weak enough that I nearly dropped to the ground. I felt an emptiness where that presence had been no less terrifying, because it left behind an echo, a sense that I had been judged and allowed to leave, but not free of consequences. I stumbled back to my car, each breath ragged in my chest all the way home. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those lights trailing me by the time I reached my driveway. My clothes were damp with sweat, and my heartbeat thrummed so violently I thought it would crack my ribs. I fumbled my keys and almost couldn't open my front door. Once I was inside, I leaned against the wall, letting out a shuddering breath I'd been holding since it began. I don't know exactly what lurks out there, but I'm certain it's something beyond my understanding. The road hasn't changed on a map. It's still just a simple dirt path winding through farmland. But when I recall the feeling of that presence, the hum that resonated inside me, I'm convinced there are pockets of our world that defy logic, places where reality thins and something else bleeds through. I don't walk there at night anymore. I've promised myself I won't be that foolhardy again. Sometimes during the day, I'll catch a glimpse of it in my peripheral vision. Two faint lights gone in a blink, and the air around me will feel colder, pressing a reminder into my bones. People often say the unknown is the scariest thing of all, and I agree wholeheartedly. Whatever it is that hovers along that lonely stretch of rural road, I have no desire to understand it anymore. My sanity clings to the idea that I made it out, that I can choose not to go back. Yet a part of me worries that I'll never truly escape, because even here in the safety of my home late at night, when I close my eyes, I still see those lights dancing in the darkness. Hear that low hum beneath my own heartbeat and feel the cold emptiness stretch its fingers around my mind, and I know beyond any doubt that it's waiting for me, patient and quiet in the place where the warmth of day fades and the chill of something far more sinister takes hold. Might of the night I first set foot in that building, I felt as if every shadow had eyes. The dim corridor lights flickered against the polished floors, casting reflections that rippled like dark water. An uncanny chill enveloped me, and it wasn't just the air conditioning. Something felt tangibly wrong. My heart pounded with the unfamiliar pressure of stepping into a place that seemed to resent my presence. Little did I know that first wave of unease was just the beginning. I took this late-night cleaning shift because I needed the extra money. I worked days as a maintenance assistant in a warehouse, but inflation and unexpected expenses hit me hard when a friend mentioned that a commercial building downtown was looking for someone to handle nightly sanitation. I jumped at the opportunity. The job sounded straightforward enough. Empty the trash vacuum, the hallways, wipe down surfaces in the waiting areas, and lock up before dawn. Simple tasks I was already familiar with, though I never anticipated the sense of dread that would seep into my bones each night during the first week. Nothing too dramatic happened. I'd walk the empty corridors. After all, the clinics had closed. My footsteps echoing off the tall ceilings, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, sometimes fluttering out for a second and then humming back to life. I brushed off the flickers as poorly maintained wiring. Yet even then, I had this deep-rooted sensation of being watched. My neck prickled as though invisible eyes traced my every movement rationally. I told myself I was imagining things. This was a vacant space at midnight. After all, one evening around the time I was finishing the last hallway, I sensed something behind me. It was like a soft rhythm of footfalls that matched my pace. I spun around expecting to see someone who might have stayed late, but the corridor was empty. The overhead lights cast their faint, sickly glow on the floor. There was nowhere anyone could have hidden in those few seconds. Despite my background in hands-on labor, my hand shook so intensely that I dropped my trash bag by the time I gathered the spilled contents. My nerves were frayed, but I forced myself to carry on. I told myself I was being paranoid. As the nights passed, small details began to pile up in my mind, refusing to be dismissed. Sometimes doors that I was sure I'd locked would appear slightly ajar when I returned to them. Other times, the waiting room chairs, which I meticulously arranged in neat rows, would be subtly out of alignment. More than once, I noticed smudges on the windows of certain offices, marks that looked almost like handprints, but they were too high or at too strange an angle for anyone to have made them. Accidentally, each new incident added to an undercurrent of anxiety that pulsed through me during every shift. My responsibilities included checking all the clinics to ensure cleanliness and security. There were various types of practices in the building: a general practitioner, a physical therapy center, a small radiology unit, and a couple of dental offices. Most nights I never encountered another soul. The staff all left by early evening. It felt like I was the sole occupant of that strange and unnerving world. Yet the quiet didn't soothe me. Instead, it amplified every drip of a faucet, every hum of an electrical circuit, and every scuff of my shoe on the linoleum. It was one particularly late night, close to 2 in the morning, when something truly bizarre happened. I was making my usual rounds with a rolling trash bin. The hallway was narrower on the 6th floor, where the physical therapy center was located. The lights there were older, casting a weak orange glow. Suddenly, I heard a sharp scraping noise from behind one of the locked doors. It sounded like heavy furniture being dragged across the floor. My pulse raced and my palms turned clammy. I tried to swallow, but my mouth had gone dry. I knew that clinic was closed and locked for the night because I had just passed it. Not 15 minutes earlier, even though my instincts screamed at me to leave it alone, my job required me to ensure everything was secure. With trembling hands, I searched my ring of keys, found the correct one, and turned it in the lock. When I stepped inside, the lights were off, so I used my phone's flashlight to scan the room. Nothing appeared out of place. The massage tables were aligned along the walls, and the chairs remained neatly tucked under the reception desk. My heart thudded like a drum, so loud that I thought it might echo against the walls. Then my flashlight caught something that sent a jolt of fear up my spine. The wheelchair that usually sat abandoned in the corner was now facing the door. That piece of equipment had always been turned toward the window. its wheels locked in position, but it was undeniably pointed right at me. I backed away slowly as if the chair might roll forward on its own. The rational part of me tried to explain it. Maybe someone used it earlier and forgot to rotate it back, but at that hour, and who would drag a piece of furniture around without leaving it out of place? Shaking, I closed the door, double-checked the lock, and continued my rounds, doing my best to forget the uneasy suspicion that I wasn't alone in the building over the subsequent nights. More unsettling incidents took place. I began to notice the wheelchair shifting positions. Not every night, but often enough that I couldn't dismiss it as happenstance. Sometimes it was a mere inch from its original position. Other times it faced a different corner altogether. Each time I opened that door, my heart hammered against my ribs, and a cold sweat broke out on my forehead. I would quickly do my cleaning, refusing to glance at the chair for too long and hurry out. At some point, I must have mentioned these bizarre occurrences to the security guard who occasionally patrolled the lobby. He merely shook his head and said quietly that he also felt something uncanny in the corridors. At night, he didn't detail it further, but his expression said enough. I wasn't imagining things. Even so, I tried to push that acknowledgement away, admitting that something truly unexplainable was happening. Felt like stepping off a cliff into dark, bottomless waters. As the weeks went on, the sense of being followed grew stronger. I'd sometimes catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow that darted around a corner or a shape that slid into an office. Whenever I tried to chase after it, I found only empty rooms and silent, sterile corridors. My hands would tremble, a slick film of sweat covering my palms. My breath would come in quick, shallow gasps as if I'd just run a marathon. I began second-guessing my own senses after all, who wouldn't question their sanity. Under those conditions, I started going to bed later and later, spending hours on the couch at home after my shift, staring at the turned-off TV, replaying every bizarre moment in my mind. A gnawing sense of dread settled over my everyday life. It was worse on the nights I had to clock in because the anticipation of returning to that building weighed on me like an anchor around my ankles in an attempt to feel more secure. I started carrying a small flashlight on my belt and a utility knife in my back pocket. The flashlight was mostly for my own peace of mind, but the weight of the knife reassured me, even though I couldn't say what I was defending myself against. The blade offered a tiny measure of psychological comfort. One particularly harrowing night, the power went out across an entire floor. Just as I stepped off the elevator, the corridor was plunged into total darkness. The only light came from the weak emergency bulbs above the exit signs. I fumbled for my flashlight, my heart thudding like it was going to burst out of my chest. In that murky glow, the hallway seemed to stretch on forever, its edges dissolving into blackness. My legs felt heavy, but I forced myself to move forward. Each step echoed unnaturally, as if the hallway wanted me to hear my own fear reverberating. My mouth was so dry I could barely swallow when a sudden crash erupted from a nearby office. I almost dropped my flashlight, fighting the urge to run. I carefully pushed open the door. It was the same physical therapy room as before. The wheelchair now lay on its side, one wheel still spinning slowly as if it had just been toppled. My instincts clamored for me to flee, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from that slowly rotating wheel. It felt as if someone was in that room with me, just out of view, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal themselves. The tension was suffocating, like a lead weight pressing down on my chest. My breath rasped in my throat. I found the light switch near the entrance, but flicking it on did nothing. The office was swallowed in darkness, except for my flashlight's narrow beam. I paused, scanning every corner, every shadow. My knife in one shaking hand, nothing stirred. Finally, I picked the wheelchair up and set it in its usual spot, my pulse still racing the instant I left the office. The hallway lights flickered back on. That was enough for the night. I told myself I would finish early. I rushed through the remaining tasks and signed out. After that, I avoided the 6th floor as much as possible, but I couldn't neglect my duties entirely. The next few days were relatively calm, aside from the persistent feeling of being watched. Then an incident occurred that shattered any illusion of normalcy I had been clinging to. I was on the 9th floor collecting trash from a waiting area when I heard a resonant whisper as if someone was calling my name from a few feet away. The voice was soft, almost gentle, but it cut through the silence like a knife. My entire body froze, every hair on my arms and neck standing upright. I looked around wildly, shining my flashlight behind the chairs and around the reception desk. No one was there at that moment. My rational brain gave way to pure panic. I sprinted to the elevator, stabbing the button repeatedly, my breath ragged hard pounding against my ribs. The elevator doors took an eternity to open when they finally slid apart. I dove in and nearly fell against the back wall, my knees weak with terror. I jabbed the button for the lobby and watched with mounting dread as the doors closed, as if I expected something or someone to slip inside. At the last second, the ride down was excruciatingly slow, and in that tiny metal box, I couldn't rid myself of the suffocating sensation that I was not alone. My eyes scanned every corner, expecting a shape to emerge from the shadows. The following night, I tried to rationalize that I was merely sleep-deprived, that stress was taking its toll. But deep down, I couldn't deny that something was fundamentally wrong with that building at night. Sometimes I felt a presence behind me so strongly that I'd whirl around abruptly only to find the corridor empty. My palms would sweat uncontrollably and my chest would tighten. I could feel my sanity fraying like an overstretched rubber band on the verge of snapping things. Escalated to a final confrontation that made me question my own senses more than ever. I was doing my rounds near midnight, trying to push through the tension by mentally reciting a list of chores reaching the physical therapy suite. I steeled myself before unlocking the door. My plan was to do a quick sweep and leave. As I entered, the overhead lights flickered, and I saw the wheelchair in the far corner facing the window again for a moment. I breathed a shaky sigh of relief. At least it appeared normal. But the second I stepped farther into the room, the lights went out with a loud pop. Complete darkness enveloped me. My flashlight flicked on, revealing the wheelchair's reflective metal. My hand was trembling so much that the beam quivered across the walls. A faint scraping sound like metal against linoleum came from somewhere in the darkness. It was followed by a soft squeak reminiscent of an old hinge being forced to move. My entire body tensed. I jerked the flashlight around, searching for the source in its narrow beam. The wheelchair was now angled slightly toward me, as if it had moved on its own. My breath caught in my throat. A wave of cold terror rolled through me, leaving me paralyzed for a few heartbeats. Something inside me snapped. Then the blend of fear, paranoia, and exhaustion ignited a surge of adrenaline. I flipped the flashlight off, plunged in darkness, and darted out the door. Not caring if I dropped my supplies, as I ran down the corridor, I sensed something behind me, but I refused to look back. My lungs burned and my heart pounded so violently that I thought it might burst. I sprinted to the elevator, stabbed the button, and when the doors didn't open immediately, I dashed to the stairwell. Instead, I practically flew down those steps, the sound of my frantic footsteps echoing in the enclosed space. Each thump fueled by the raw animalistic instinct to get away. When I finally burst out into the lobby, I could barely catch my breath. The security guard gave me a concerned look, but I just muttered that I was done for the night and left as quickly as possible. Once I was outside, the cool night air felt like an otherworldly blessing. I practically fell into my car and locked the doors, letting out a shuddering breath that felt like it had been stuck in my chest for days. That was my last shift. I never returned to that building. Maybe I let down the management by not giving notice or returning the keys in person, but I couldn't bring myself to step foot in there again. When I dropped off the keys at the administrative office the next morning, I simply told them I couldn't fulfill my duties anymore. There was no argument from their side, just a collected nod as if they'd heard this before. Even weeks later, I still can't shake the feeling that something followed me out of that place at night. When the house is quiet, I sometimes imagine that I hear faint scraping sounds in the corners or detect movement in my peripheral vision. My heart still races at unexpected noises, and I've started leaving multiple lights on, even though it costs more on my electricity bill just to keep the darkness at bay. I don't know what truly lurks in those corridors after midnight. Perhaps it's my own mind unraveling under pressure, or perhaps something inexplicable resides there. feeding on the loneliness and silence. All I know is that the experience changed me. My pulse quickens even now at the memory of the wheelchair angled toward the door as if waiting for me. It stands as a testament to the shadows we can't fully explain and the horrors that might exist just beyond our narrow scope of understanding. I walked away with my life intact and no tangible scars. Yet the haunting reality of that building is something I carry inside me. Every time I close my eyes, I'm back in that dark corridor, hearing the faint scrape of something that shouldn't be there, feeling an unseen presence breathing down my neck, and I'm certain I'll never truly be alone again.